He was the handsome, successful doctor from a prominent family, living an idyllic life in a house on the shores of Lake Erie. But on a quiet July night, he would tell a story of a violent, bushy-haired intruder, a story that would either make him the tragic victim of a brutal home invasion or the cold-blooded architect of one of America's most infamous murder mysteries. His name was Dr. Sam Sheppard. Tonight, we journey into stories where the glare of the media becomes a character in the crime itself. These are cases where the court of public opinion convenes long before the real one, where headlines become verdicts, and where the narrative created by the press becomes more powerful and more enduring than the evidence presented in a courtroom. It's the relentless clatter of typewriter keys and the flash of camera bulbs in a darkened hallway, the hum of a nation gathered around their new television sets, consuming a tragedy as if it were a weekly drama, and the chilling realization that a man's guilt or innocence can be decided by the power of a single, well-told story. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. It's always a humbling experience to see how far these stories travel, and how many of us are gathered here in this shared, quiet space. And on that note, if you truly appreciate what we do here, the quiet, respectful space we try to create for these stories, a like and a subscribe is the very best way to show it. It helps us continue this journey together. Now, dim the lights. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Sam Sheppard case in the summer of 1954, the Cleveland suburb of Bay Village, Ohio, was the very picture of tranquil, post-war American prosperity. It was a wealthy enclave on the serene shores of Lake Erie, a place of sprawling, well-manicured lawns, impressive homes, and a quiet, unshakable sense of security. It was the kind of community where people didn't lock their doors, where children played freely in the streets until dusk, and where violent crime was something that happened in other places to other people. And at the heart of this idyllic community, in a beautiful white colonial house at 28924 Lake Road, lived a family that seemed to be the embodiment of the American dream. The Sheppards. Dr. Samuel Sam Sheppard was, by all accounts, a man who had it all. At 30 years old, he was a handsome, athletic, and successful osteopathic surgeon. He was part of a local medical dynasty. His father and two older brothers were also respected doctors who ran the family-owned Bayview Hospital. He was intelligent, charismatic, and well-liked, a pillar of the community. His wife, 31-year-old Marilyn Reese Sheppard, was his high school sweetheart. She was a beautiful, vibrant woman, known for her warmth and her devotion to her family. She was 4 months pregnant with their second child. Together, they had a 7-year-old son, Samuel Chip Sheppard, and a life that, from the outside, seemed utterly perfect. They were a golden couple, living a life of privilege and promise in a picture-perfect town. On the evening of July 3rd, 1954, the Sheppards hosted a dinner party for their neighbors. It was a casual, pleasant evening. They ate, they drank, they watched the movie Strange Holiday on their television set. After their friends left, Marilyn saw her husband off to bed. Sam, however, claimed he was too tired to make it upstairs. He was wearing a corduroy jacket and a t-shirt. He settled onto the daybed in the downstairs living room, overlooking the lake, and drifted off to sleep. The house grew quiet, the only sound the gentle lapping of the lake against the shore. The perfect, ordinary evening was about to give way to a night of unimaginable horror. The story of what happened next would be told and retold and endlessly debated for decades. The only account of the initial events came from Sam Sheppard himself. According to his version, he was awoken in the deep of the night by the sound of his wife's voice crying out his name from their upstairs bedroom. "Sam! Sam!" He said he ran upstairs in a daze. As he entered the dimly lit bedroom, he was immediately confronted by a form, a figure standing near his wife's bed. Before he could even register what was happening, he was struck from behind, a powerful blow to the back of his neck that knocked him unconscious. He would later claim to have woken up sometime later, disoriented, on the floor of the bedroom. He checked his own pulse. He then reached for his wife in the darkness. Her face was wet and sticky. He fumbled for the light and saw a scene of almost incomprehensible brutality. Marilyn Sheppard lay on her bed, her pajamas pulled up, her body bludgeoned and stabbed in a frenzied, savage attack. The walls, the bed, The entire room was a bloodbath. In a state of shock, he went downstairs. He saw that the front door was ajar. He then saw a figure, a bushy-haired man, running out of the house and down toward the lake. Primal, protective instinct took over. Sheppard chased the man down the long flight of stairs that led from their property to the beach. He tackled the intruder from behind, and a struggle ensued in the shallow water of the lake. Sheppard claimed he was choked, and he once again lost consciousness. He woke up sometime later, half in and half out of the water, his face in the sand, his shirt ripped from his body. He staggered back up to the house, his mind a fog of shock and confusion. At approximately 5:40 a.m. on the morning of July 4th, the phone rang at the home of J. Spencer Houck, the mayor of Bay Village and a close friend and neighbor of the Sheppards. It was Sam Sheppard. His voice was thick, groggy. "My God, Spen," he said. "Get over here. I think they've killed Marilyn." Mayor Houck and his wife rushed next door. They found a scene of bizarre, disquieting chaos. The house seemed to have been ransacked in a strange, almost performative way. Drawers were pulled out, but their contents were not disturbed. Sam Sheppard's doctor's bag was overturned on the floor. Its instruments spilled out, but nothing of value seemed to be taken. And upstairs, in the bedroom, was the horrific, bloody scene of Marilyn's murder. The mayor immediately called the police. The first officers to arrive were from the small Bay Village police force. They were patrolmen, not homicide detectives, and they were completely unprepared for a crime of this magnitude. The crime scene from the very beginning was catastrophically compromised. As news of the murder spread through the small community, neighbors, friends, and members of the Sheppard family began to descend on the house. They walked through the rooms, they touched things, they offered their condolences, all while potential evidence was being trampled, smudged, and destroyed. From the moment the police arrived, they felt that something was wrong with Sam Sheppard's story. He was disoriented and seemed to be in shock, but his physical injuries, a bruised face, a swollen eye, some neck pain, seemed remarkably minor compared to the savage violence that had been inflicted upon his wife. His story of a bushy-haired intruder and two separate instances of losing consciousness seemed strange and hard to believe. The police began to look at him with suspicion. Why was his t-shirt missing, but not his trousers or his belt? Why were there no signs of a forced entry? Why would a burglar commit such a frenzied, violent murder and then leave valuables, like Sam's watch, untouched? The investigators also noted a distinct bloodstain on Sam's trousers, a spot that seemed to come from a bloody object being pressed against it. And most damningly, they could find no evidence of the bushy-haired intruder. There were no strange footprints on the sandy beach, no witnesses who had seen a suspicious figure, no sign of anyone else having been there at all. The focus of the investigation, almost immediately, began to shift away from the search for a mysterious, shadowy intruder and toward the only other adult who was known to have been in the house that night. The quiet, idyllic facade of the Sheppard family's life had been shattered, and in its place, a dark and terrible suspicion was beginning to grow. The police, and soon, the entire nation, began to ask the same terrifying question. Was Dr. Sam Sheppard a grieving husband and a heroic victim? Or was he a cold-blooded killer who had concocted an elaborate story to cover up the murder of his pregnant wife? The murder of a prominent doctor's pregnant wife in a wealthy, placid suburb was a story tailor-made for sensationalism. In the days following the crime, the full, crushing weight of the mid-century American media machine descended upon the small town of Bay Village. The case became a front-page obsession, particularly for Cleveland's three rival newspapers: the Cleveland Press, the Plain Dealer, and the Cleveland News. In a fierce competition for circulation, they seized upon the Sheppard case with a ravenous intensity, and it was their coverage that would shape the public's perception of the crime, and of Dr. Sam Sheppard himself, long before he ever set foot in a courtroom. The press, led by the influential and aggressive editor of the Cleveland Press, Louis B. Seltzer, immediately cast Sheppard in the role of the villain. They latched onto the inconsistencies in his story, his seemingly minor injuries, and his cool, detached demeanor in the face of an unspeakable tragedy. They portrayed him not as a grieving husband, but as a cold, arrogant, and deceptive man who was hiding a dark secret. The newspapers began a relentless campaign to convict him in the court of public opinion. The headlines were sensational, accusatory, and often based on little more than rumor and innuendo. "Somebody is getting away with murder," one headline screamed. "Why isn't Sam Sheppard in jail?" another demanded. They published stories detailing Sheppard's alleged extramarital affairs, painting him as a philandering, unfaithful husband who had a clear motive to get rid of his pregnant wife. A key figure in this narrative was a former lab technician at the family hospital named Susan Hayes, with whom Sheppard had been having a long-term affair. The affair, which Sheppard had initially denied, became the centerpiece of the prosecution's emerging theory of motive. A classic story of a man wanting to be free of his wife to be with his mistress. The media pressure on the local authorities was immense. The Bay Village Police and the Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office, feeling the heat of the public outrage being fanned by the press, began to treat Sheppard less like a victim and more like a guilty man who had not yet been charged. They subjected him to grueling, multi-hour interrogations. They refused to allow his family's lawyer to be present during the questioning. They even staged a dramatic and highly publicized reenactment of the crime at the house, forcing Sheppard to walk through his own story, looking for any slip-up, any deviation that could be used against him. The coroner for Cuyahoga County, a man named Dr. Samuel Gerber, who had a flair for the dramatic and a close relationship with the press, quickly became a key figure in the case against Sheppard. At a televised, standing-room-only inquest held just a few weeks after the murder, Gerber publicly grilled Sheppard, peppering him with accusatory questions. He openly dismissed Sheppard's story of a bushy-haired intruder as a fabrication, and he presented a key piece of physical evidence that he claimed was the murder weapon: a strange, T-shaped bloodstain on the pillowcase next to Marilyn's head. Gerber theorized that this stain had been made by a surgical instrument, a weapon that only a doctor like Sam Sheppard would have had access to. The surgical instrument theory, though it was based on little more than speculation, became a powerful and damning part of the public narrative. The cumulative effect of this relentless, one-sided media campaign was overwhelming. By the time Sam Sheppard was finally arrested and charged with the first-degree murder of his wife on July 30th, 1954, much of the public, and certainly most of the people in Cleveland, had already convicted him. He was no longer a respected surgeon. He was the arrogant, adulterous Dr. Sam, the man who had brutally murdered his pregnant wife and then concocted a clumsy, unbelievable story to cover it up. The trial, which began in October 1954, was one of the most famous and sensational media circuses of the 20th century. The small Cleveland courtroom was packed every day with reporters from across the country and around the world. The judge, Edward Blythen, made little effort to control the chaotic atmosphere. He allowed reporters to have a long table set up directly in front of the judge's bench, inside the bar, just a few feet from the jury box. The jurors were not sequestered. They were allowed to go home every night, where they were free to read the sensational newspaper accounts and watch the nightly television reports about the case. The names and addresses of the jurors were even published in the newspapers, exposing them to immense public pressure. The courtroom was not a sanctum of justice. It was a theater, and the trial was a performance for the benefit of the press. The prosecution's case was the one that had already been laid out in the newspapers. They presented Sam Sheppard as a man who was living a double life, a man whose respectable, family man facade concealed a secret world of affairs and deception. They argued that he had wanted to be free of his marriage to Marilyn to pursue his relationship with Susan Hayes, and that he had killed his wife in a fit of rage during an argument. They presented the evidence of the surgical instrument bloodstain, the lack of a forced entry, and the inconsistencies in Sheppard's own story. The defense, led by attorney William Corrigan, argued fiercely that the police had bungled the investigation from the very beginning. He pointed to the contaminated crime scene, the dozens of unidentified fingerprints that were never matched, and the failure of the police to seriously investigate any other suspects. He argued that the police and the prosecutor, under intense pressure from the media, had fixated on Sheppard from the first day and had ignored any evidence that pointed to an intruder. He presented Sheppard's injuries as proof that he had been in a struggle and argued that the story of the bushy-haired man was the truth. But the defense was fighting an uphill battle against a tidal wave of negative publicity. The atmosphere in the courtroom was so charged, the presumption of guilt so pervasive, that a fair trial was almost impossible. The jury was swimming in a sea of prejudicial information. The press had created a narrative, and the trial was simply playing out the script that had already been written. In December 1954, after a 9-week trial, the jury returned its verdict. They found Dr. Sam Sheppard guilty of second-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to life in prison. The city of Cleveland erupted in celebration. The newspapers proclaimed that justice had been served. The case was closed. Dr. Sam Sheppard, the man who had once been the symbol of the American dream, was now a convicted killer, sent away to a state penitentiary to spend the rest of his life behind bars. But for a small group of people who believed in his innocence, including his family and a new, tenacious defense attorney who would soon enter the picture, the fight was far from over. The first trial had ended, but the long, strange, and epic saga of the Sheppard case was just beginning. Dr. Sam Sheppard entered the Ohio Penitentiary in 1955 as inmate #116-204. A convicted murderer stripped of his name, his profession, and his freedom. The public, by and large, accepted the verdict as the final word. The sensational headlines faded, and the case of the murdered doctor's wife began to recede into the annals of crime history. But a small, dedicated group refused to let the story die. Sheppard's family, particularly his 2 brothers, maintained his innocence with an unwavering conviction. And soon, a new and powerful legal force would enter the picture. A man who would dedicate his career to proving that Sam Sheppard was the victim of a profound miscarriage of justice. His name was F. Lee Bailey. Bailey was a young, brilliant, and fiercely ambitious defense attorney from Boston who was just beginning to make a name for himself. He became fascinated by the Sheppard case, convinced that the trial had been a travesty, a conviction born not from evidence, but from a media-driven hysteria. He saw in the case an opportunity to make his mark and to challenge what he saw as a deeply flawed justice system. He took on Sheppard's case in the early 1960s and began a relentless, multi-year campaign of appeals. Bailey's strategy was to attack not the facts of the case, but the fairness of the trial itself. He argued that the carnival atmosphere of the 1954 trial, fueled by the massive, prejudicial, and often inaccurate media coverage, had made it impossible for Sheppard to receive a fair hearing. He meticulously documented the sensational headlines, the judge's failure to control the courtroom, and the fact that the jury had not been sequestered, leaving them exposed to a daily barrage of public opinion that presumed his client's guilt. His appeals worked their way slowly through the court system, being denied at every level. But Bailey was relentless. Finally, in 1966, 12 years after the original conviction, the case reached the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court of the United States. In a landmark decision, Sheppard versus Maxwell, the Supreme Court overturned Sam Sheppard's murder conviction. The court's 8-1 decision was a scathing indictment of the original trial. Justice Tom C. Clark, writing for the majority, described the proceedings as having been conducted in a Roman holiday atmosphere for the press. He wrote that the massive, pervasive, and prejudicial publicity had deprived Sheppard of his constitutional right to a fair trial. The decision was a landmark ruling on the conflict between the First Amendment right to a free press and the Sixth Amendment right to a fair trial, and it established new standards for judges to control media access and to protect juries from prejudicial outside influence. The Supreme Court's decision meant that Sam Sheppard, after spending more than a decade in prison, was a free man, but he was not an exonerated one. The state of Ohio still had the right to retry him for the murder of his wife. The second trial of Dr. Sam Sheppard began in the fall of 1966, and it was a world away from the media circus of 1954. The new judge, a no-nonsense jurist named Francis Talty, enforced strict controls on the press. The jury was sequestered, and Sam Sheppard now had a legal superstar, F. Lee Bailey, at the head of his defense team. The prosecution, hampered by the passage of time and the loss of key witnesses, presented largely the same circumstantial case they had in 1954. They argued that Sheppard was a philanderer who had killed his wife in a fit of rage. But F. Lee Bailey came to court with a powerful new counter-narrative and a new, more aggressive defense. He began by systematically dismantling the prosecution's key pieces of physical evidence. He called expert witnesses who testified that the so-called surgical instrument bloodstain on the pillow was not made by a surgical tool at all, but was simply a wrinkle in the fabric that had been soaked in blood. Most importantly, Bailey presented a compelling alternate theory of the crime, one that focused on a specific named suspect. He argued that the real killer was a man named Richard Eberling. Eberling was a window washer who had been employed by the Sheppards and had been in their home just a few days before the murder. Bailey revealed that Eberling had a criminal record, that he was known to be a petty thief, and that he had been caught stealing from his clients. He presented a witness who claimed that Eberling had sold a ring belonging to Marilyn Sheppard just days after the murder. The most damning piece of evidence against Eberling came from a woman who had been his caregiver years later. She testified that Eberling had confessed to her, in a rambling, drug-fueled conversation, that he had been the one who killed Marilyn Sheppard. He had described the crime in detail, claiming he had gone to the house to steal, had been discovered by Marilyn, and had killed her in a panic. Bailey argued that the bushy-haired intruder that Sam Sheppard had described was, in fact, Richard Eberling. He painted a picture of a botched robbery that had turned into a frenzied murder, a theory that accounted for the ransacked appearance of the house and the extreme brutality of the attack. He argued that the police, in their rush to convict Dr. Sam, had completely overlooked a far more plausible suspect who was right under their noses. The defense was powerful and persuasive. Lee Bailey, in his closing argument, was masterful. He portrayed Sam Sheppard not as a killer, but as a tragic figure, a man who had lost his wife and his child, and then had his freedom stolen from him by a corrupt system and a hysterical press. After a short trial, the case went to the jury. This time, the deliberation was brief. On November 16, 1966, the jury returned its verdict. Not guilty. Sam Sheppard was finally and definitively a free man. He walked out of the courtroom into the arms of his family, cleared of the crime that had defined his life for the past 12 years. The verdict was a stunning vindication, a testament to the power of a single, tenacious lawyer to right what he saw as a terrible wrong. But the legal victory could not erase the years of loss, nor could it give him back the life he had lost. The long, public nightmare was over, but the private one would continue. The acquittal of Dr. Sam Sheppard in his second trial was a moment of profound legal and personal triumph, but it was not a happy ending. The man who emerged from prison after a decade of incarceration was not the same handsome, confident surgeon who had entered it. He was a broken man, haunted by the murder of his wife, the loss of his career, and the long public ordeal that had destroyed his reputation and his family. After his release, Sheppard attempted to piece his life back together, but the shadow of the case was too long. He tried to resume his medical career, but his license had been revoked, and the stigma of the case followed him everywhere. He briefly found a new and deeply strange kind of celebrity. He married the daughter of a German pen pal he had corresponded with from prison, a woman named Ariane Teben-Johans. For a short time, in a bizarre and desperate attempt to make a living, he became a professional wrestler, billing himself as the Killer, a grotesque parody of his own tragic fame. But the wrestling career was short-lived, and his health, both physical and mental, was in a steep decline. He struggled with alcoholism, and his new marriage quickly fell apart. On April 6, 1970, just 4 years after his acquittal, Dr. Sam Sheppard died of liver failure. He was only 46 years old. He went to his grave a legally innocent man, but a man who had never truly escaped the prison of his own tragedy. The case, however, did not die with him. The question of who killed Marilyn Sheppard remained officially unsolved, a tantalizing mystery that continued to fascinate the public and inspire new generations of investigators. The story became a cultural touchstone, most famously as the direct inspiration for the hit 1960s television series The Fugitive and later, the Harrison Ford film of the same name. The story of a respected doctor, wrongly convicted of his wife's murder, who escapes to hunt for the real one-armed man who killed her, was a fictionalized version of Sam Sheppard's long fight for vindication. The case was resurrected once again in the 1990s by Sam Sheppard's son, Chip. Chip Sheppard, who had been just 7 years old at the time of his mother's murder, had spent his entire life convinced of his father's innocence. He dedicated himself to clearing his father's name, not just legally, but in the court of history. He championed the theory that Richard Eberling, the window washer, was the real killer. In a new legal effort, Chip Sheppard filed a wrongful imprisonment lawsuit against the state of Ohio, hoping to get a court to officially declare his father innocent. This new trial, which took place in 2000, allowed for the introduction of evidence that had been unavailable in the 1960s. DNA testing. The DNA evidence was seen as the great hope, the one thing that could, finally, definitively solve the mystery. The prosecution's original case had rested, in part, on a bloodstain on Sam Sheppard's watch, which they claimed was his wife's. The defense had long argued that this was a fundamental misunderstanding of the evidence. They now had the chance to prove it. They also tested blood spots found on the trousers Sam was wearing that night and a large bloodstain found on a closet door in the bedroom. The results of the DNA testing were complex and, like so much else in this case, ultimately ambiguous. The tests confirmed that the blood on Sam Sheppard's trousers was his wife's, a fact that both sides had always acknowledged. But crucially, the large bloodstain on the closet door was found to contain DNA from a third, unidentified person. This was powerful evidence supporting the defense's long-standing claim of an intruder. The tests also concluded that the blood on Sam's watch was, in fact, his own, not his wife's, disproving a key part of the original prosecution's theory. Most tantalizingly, a single spot of blood found in the house was tested against the DNA of Richard Eberling. The results showed that Eberling could not be excluded as the source. It was not a definitive match, but it was a significant link, placing him at the scene of the crime. Despite this new evidence, the jury in the 2000 civil trial was not convinced. They sided with the state of Ohio, rejecting the wrongful imprisonment claim. They were not persuaded that the evidence was strong enough to definitively prove Sam Sheppard's innocence. And so, even with the power of modern science, the case ended where it had always been, in a state of profound, unsettling ambiguity. The legacy of the Sam Sheppard case is a powerful and enduring one. It is a landmark case in the history of American law, a story that forever changed the relationship between the media and the justice system. The Supreme Court's decision in Sheppard versus Maxwell remains a cornerstone of legal precedent, a constant reminder to judges of their duty to protect a defendant's right to a fair trial from the overwhelming influence of a sensationalist press. But beyond its legal significance, the case endures as a great American mystery. It is a story with two equally compelling and mutually exclusive narratives. In one version, Sam Sheppard is a cold-blooded killer, a man who brutally murdered his pregnant wife and then used his intelligence, his family's wealth, and the brilliance of a celebrity lawyer to escape justice. In the other, he is a tragic victim, a man who not only lost his wife and his unborn child to a brutal intruder, but then lost his own freedom to a flawed investigation and a media-driven witch hunt. The truth of what happened in that White House on the shore of Lake Erie on that July night in 1954 likely died with the people who were there. The case remains a testament to the fallibility of the justice system, the power of the media to shape reality, and the profound, enduring difficulty of ever truly knowing the truth. It is a story that began with a single brutal act of violence and spiraled into a decades-long saga of law, media, and memory. A story that, even after all these years, refuses to give us the comfort of a final, certain answer. The Lockerbie bombing the night of December 21, 1988, was a night of quiet, pre-holiday anticipation. It was the winter solstice, the longest night of the year, and a deep, cold darkness had settled over the British Isles. At London's Heathrow Airport, one of the busiest hubs in the world, the atmosphere was a familiar, festive chaos. The terminals were thronged with travelers heading home for Christmas, their arms laden with gifts, their faces a mixture of weariness and excitement. Among the myriad of flights listed on the departure boards was one that was a nightly institution. Pan Am Flight 103, a Boeing 747 named the Maid of the Seas, bound for New York's JFK Airport. For the 243 passengers who boarded the jumbo jet that evening, this was simply the final leg of a journey. Among them were families looking forward to being reunited for the holidays. There were business travelers, diplomats, and military personnel. And most poignantly, there was a group of 35 students from Syracuse University, bright, exuberant young men and women who were flying home after a semester spent studying abroad in London and Florence. They were full of stories, of new experiences, of the quiet, confident energy of youth on the cusp of a future that seemed limitless. They had bought Christmas sweaters, they had said their goodbyes to their new friends, and now they were just a 7-hour flight away from home. The 16 crew members, led by Captain Jim McQuarrie, were seasoned professionals. This flight was a routine they had performed countless times. They went through their pre-flight checks with a practiced, calm efficiency. The massive 747 was loaded with luggage, cargo, and enough fuel for its transatlantic journey. At 6:25 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, the Maid of the Seas pushed back from the gate and, after a short taxi, took off into the cold, dark sky. The plane climbed gracefully, a magnificent machine carrying 259 souls, ascending toward its cruising altitude. Miles below, in the rolling hills of southern Scotland, the small market town of Lockerbie was settling in for a quiet winter's evening. It was a peaceful, close-knit community of about 4,000 people, a town of stone houses, quiet streets, and a deep, abiding sense of tranquility. Families were gathered in their living rooms, watching television, decorating their Christmas trees, and wrapping the last of their presents. The world of international travel and the sleek, powerful jetliner passing more than 5 miles above them was a distant, completely separate reality. On board Flight 103, the atmosphere was one of routine contentment. The plane had reached its cruising altitude of 31,000 feet. The seatbelt sign had been switched off. Passengers were settling in for the long flight, reading, chatting, or dozing off. The flight attendants were preparing the dinner service. In the cockpit, Captain McQuarrie and his crew were monitoring their instruments, everything appearing perfectly normal. They were just passing over the Scottish border, their instruments showing a ground speed of over 500 miles per hour. At 7:02 p.m. and 50 seconds, inside the forward cargo hold, a small, sophisticated bomb, hidden inside a Toshiba radiocassette player, which was itself packed inside a Samsonite suitcase, detonated. The bomb was not a massive one. It was made of just 12 to 16 ounces of a plastic explosive known as Semtex. But at 31,000 feet in the pressurized environment of a jumbo jet moving at high speed, it was more than enough. The explosion was instantaneous and catastrophic. It punched a 20-inch hole in the left side of the fuselage, a violent explosive decompression that was like puncturing the skin of a balloon. The air in the cabin, pressurized to a breathable level, rushed out into the near vacuum of the upper atmosphere with explosive force. The temperature inside the plane plunged to 45 degrees below zero in a fraction of a second. A dense, choking fog filled the cabin. The massive differential pressure between the inside and the outside of the aircraft exerted an unimaginable stress on the plane's structure. The initial blast and the subsequent decompression wave tore the 747 apart with horrifying speed. The entire nose section of the aircraft, including the cockpit, was ripped away from the main fuselage. It sheared off into the darkness, a silent, falling tomb containing the flight crew and a number of first-class passengers, beginning its long, terrifying plunge to the ground. The main section of the fuselage, the wings, and the 4 massive engines continued on their forward trajectory for a few more seconds, a headless, wounded beast, before it too began to break apart. The fuselage went into a steep, almost vertical dive. The wings, still filled with thousands of gallons of jet fuel, separated and began to fall. The violence of the breakup was so extreme that bodies, luggage, and pieces of the aircraft were scattered over a vast area. On the ground in Lockerbie, the first sign that something was wrong was a sound. Residents heard a low, deep rumbling in the distance, a sound that grew rapidly into a deafening, thunderous roar, as if the sky itself were being torn apart. They looked up and saw a sight that defied all comprehension. The night sky was on fire. A massive, burning object was falling from the clouds, descending upon their quiet town. At 7:04 p.m., just over a minute after the initial breakup, the largest section of the plane, the wings and the central fuel tanks containing nearly 200,000 pounds of jet fuel, slammed into the earth. It hit a residential street on the western edge of town, a quiet neighborhood called Sherwood Crescent. The impact was cataclysmic. The fuel ignited in a massive, mushroom cloud-shaped fireball that shot hundreds of feet into the air, illuminating the entire town with a ghastly, orange light. The impact registered 1.6 on the Richter scale. It created a crater 155 feet long and more than 30 feet deep, vaporizing several houses and everything and everyone inside them. The rest of the plane rained down on the town and the surrounding countryside. The cockpit section crashed into a field just outside of town, narrowly missing a church. The main passenger cabin sections fell into gardens and onto rooftops. Debris, both metal and human, was scattered over an area of more than 845 square miles. The immediate aftermath was a scene of apocalyptic, almost medieval horror. The quiet, peaceful town of Lockerbie had been transformed, in an instant, into a war zone. The air was thick with the smell of aviation fuel and burning homes. Fires raged across Sherwood Crescent. The streets were littered with twisted metal, shattered luggage, Christmas presents, and the bodies of the dead. 11 residents of Lockerbie, entire families, were killed on the ground as they sat in their homes, their lives extinguished by the falling debris. The first responders, local police, firefighters, and volunteers, were met with a scene that defied all training and experience. They were not responding to a plane crash. They had been plunged into the heart of hell. They began the grim, impossible task of searching for survivors, of putting out the fires, of trying to make sense of a tragedy whose scale was almost too vast to comprehend. But it soon became clear that there were no survivors from the flight. All 259 people on board the Maid of the Seas were gone. In a single, violent moment in the sky, 270 lives had been lost. The quiet, solstice night had become the scene of the deadliest terrorist attack on British soil, and the largest, most complex criminal investigation the world had ever seen was about to begin. The immediate aftermath of the crash was a landscape of surreal, heartbreaking chaos. The small town of Lockerbie, with its handful of local police officers and volunteer firefighters, was completely overwhelmed. But in the hours that followed, a massive, coordinated response began to take shape. Help poured in from across Scotland and the north of England. Police, military units, and forensic specialists descended on the town. The initial, desperate search for survivors quickly and grimly transitioned into a massive operation of recovery and investigation. The town was sealed off, its quiet streets now a vast, open-air crime scene. The first priority was the grim, sacred task of recovering the victims. For days, search teams, many of them local residents volunteering alongside the professionals, fanned out across the 845-square-mile debris field. They walked in long, straight lines through the rolling hills, the forests, and the sheep pastures of the Scottish border country, searching for any sign of the dead. The bodies of the passengers and crew were found scattered across the landscape, many still strapped into their seats. The 11 residents of Lockerbie, who had been killed on the ground, were recovered from the ruins of their homes on Sherwood Crescent. Each victim was carefully, respectfully, removed and taken to a temporary mortuary that had been set up in the town hall. There, an international team of pathologists worked around the clock to identify the remains, a slow and agonizing process that brought home the truly global scale of the tragedy. The victims came from 21 different countries. While the recovery of the victims was underway, another equally painstaking search was beginning. This was the search for evidence. Every single piece of wreckage, from the largest sections of the fuselage to the smallest fragment of metal, was a potential clue. Investigators knew from the moment the plane's transponder signal had vanished from radar screens that this was no ordinary accident. The sudden, catastrophic nature of the event pointed to only one possibility: a bomb. The investigation was a massive joint effort, led by the Dumfries and Galloway Constabulary, the local Scottish police force, but with immense support from Britain's MI5 and MI6, and from the American FBI and CIA. The central question was not if a bomb had destroyed Flight 103, but how it had gotten on board, what it was made of, and, most importantly, who had put it there. The investigators began to reconstruct the aircraft. Every piece of wreckage that was found was tagged with its precise location, photographed, and then transported to a large hangar, where a team of engineers began the monumental task of reassembling the Maid of the Seas in a vast, three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. By piecing the plane back together, they hoped to pinpoint the exact location of the explosion. At the same time, forensic scientists were meticulously examining the pieces of wreckage and the luggage that had been recovered. They were looking for the telltale chemical residue of explosives and for any fragment of the bomb and its container that might have survived the blast. After weeks of painstaking work, they found it. On a small, twisted piece of metal from the fuselage, they found traces of two chemicals, PETN and RDX. These were the chemical signatures of Semtex, a powerful military-grade plastic explosive favored by terrorist groups around the world. Then came the breakthrough that would define the entire investigation. Buried in the Scottish soil, a forensic expert found a tiny, charred fragment of a circuit board, no bigger than a thumbnail. It was sent to the FBI's laboratory in Washington, D.C. for analysis. The FBI's experts were able to identify it as a fragment from a sophisticated electronic timer. They soon traced the timer to a small electronics firm in Zurich, Switzerland, a company called Mebo AG. The owner of Mebo confirmed that he had manufactured a small batch of these specific timers and had sold them to a single client, the Libyan intelligence service. Suddenly, the vast, anonymous scope of the investigation had a state sponsor. The trail was leading directly to the regime of the notorious Libyan dictator, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. The investigators now had the bomb, the explosive, and the timer. The next challenge was to figure out how it had gotten onto the plane. They began the painstaking process of examining every piece of luggage and clothing that had been recovered. In the debris from the baggage container that their reconstruction had identified as the seat of the explosion, they found the tattered remains of a Samsonite suitcase. And embedded within the fragments of that suitcase and the clothing that was inside it, they found more microscopic traces of the bomb. The clothing was the key. Investigators traced the labels and managed to identify the store where they had been purchased. A small boutique on the island of Malta. The shop owner remembered the man who had bought the clothes. He was a strange customer, she recalled, buying a random assortment of men's clothing, seemingly without regard for style or size. And she remembered him distinctly because the sale had taken place just before the shop closed for Christmas, and a holiday program was on the television. She described the man as being of Libyan appearance. The pieces of the puzzle were now falling into place with astonishing speed. The investigators theorized that the bomb had been packed into the suitcase in Malta, along with the clothes that would act as padding. The suitcase was then checked in as unaccompanied baggage on an Air Malta flight from Malta to Frankfurt, Germany. In Frankfurt, it was transferred as interline baggage to the first leg of Pan Am Flight 103, a feeder flight that flew from Frankfurt to London's Heathrow. At Heathrow, during the busy transit period, the suitcase was loaded into the forward cargo hold of the 747, the Maid of the Seas. It was a ghost bag, a piece of luggage without a passenger, a Trojan horse carrying a deadly secret. The investigation now had a clear, coherent narrative of the crime. All that was left was to put a face to the ghost who had bought the clothes in Malta and had started the deadly chain of events. The shop owner's description, combined with intelligence gathered about Libyan operatives known to be in Malta at the time, allowed the investigators to zero in on two men. They were both believed to be senior members of the Libyan intelligence service. Their names were Abdelbasset El-Megrahi and Lamin Khalifa Fima. In November 1991, nearly 3 years after the bombing, the United States and Scotland jointly issued indictments for the two men, formally accusing them of planting the bomb that destroyed Pan Am Flight 103. The charge was mass murder. The world now knew who the authorities believed were responsible, but charging them and bringing them to justice were two very different things. The two suspects were safe in Libya, under the protection of Colonel Gaddafi, who vehemently denied any involvement and refused to extradite them. The long, frustrating legal and diplomatic standoff had just begun. The indictment of Abdelbasset al-Megrahi and Lumen Khalifa Fhimah was a landmark moment in the Lockerbie investigation, but it was the beginning of a new and deeply frustrating chapter in the long quest for justice. The two Libyan intelligence operatives were the physical embodiment of the conspiracy, the men who had allegedly purchased the clothes, packed the bomb, and placed the ghost bag on its deadly journey. But they were safely ensconced in Libya, shielded by the defiant and unpredictable regime of Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. For the next several years, the case was locked in a state of diplomatic and legal paralysis. The United States and the United Kingdom demanded that Libya surrender the two suspects to stand trial, either in Scotland or in the US. Gaddafi flatly refused, proclaiming their innocence and denouncing the charges as a politically motivated act of Western imperialism. In response, the United Nations, led by the US and the UK, imposed a series of punishing international sanctions on Libya. These sanctions, which included an arms embargo and a ban on all air travel to and from the country, were designed to isolate the Gaddafi regime and pressure it into compliance. The standoff dragged on for the better part of a decade. During this time, the families of the victims became a powerful and relentless force for justice. They were a diverse group of ordinary people, parents, spouses, siblings, who had been united by an extraordinary tragedy. They refused to let the world forget. They formed victims' advocacy groups, they lobbied their governments, and they kept the story of Pan Am 103 alive in the media. They were a constant moral conscience, a human face for a crime that was becoming a geopolitical chess match. They did not just want sanctions, they wanted a trial, they wanted a public accounting of the facts, and they wanted to see the men who had murdered their loved ones face to face in a court of law. Finally, in the late 1990s, after years of back-channel negotiations, a complex and unprecedented legal compromise was reached. The breakthrough was brokered by figures like Nelson Mandela and Kofi Annan. Gaddafi, his country crippled by the long-standing sanctions, agreed to hand over the two suspects for trial, but they would not be tried in the US or the UK. Instead, the trial would be held in a neutral third country, the Netherlands. A special Scottish court, operating under Scottish law but sitting at a former US Air Force base called Camp Zeist, would be established to hear the case. It was a unique, one-of-a-kind solution to a unique and intractable legal problem. In 1999, more than 10 years after the bombing, Megrahi and Fhimah were finally handed over. The trial began in May of 2000. It was one of the most complex and closely watched trials in history. The case against the two men was massive, built on thousands of pieces of evidence gathered from dozens of countries over the preceding decade. But it was also almost entirely circumstantial. There was no confession, no direct eyewitness who saw them place the bomb on the plane. The prosecution's case rested on their ability to connect a series of small, seemingly disparate dots into a single, coherent, and convincing narrative. The key dots were these: the fragment of the timer circuit board, which had been traced to the Swiss company Mebo and sold exclusively to Libya; the testimony of the Maltese shopkeeper, Tony Gaussi, who identified Megrahi as the man who had bought the clothes that were found packed around the bomb; and the airline records that placed Megrahi and Fhimah, both known intelligence operatives, in Malta at the exact time the ghost bag was believed to have begun its journey. The prosecution, led by a team of Scottish lawyers, methodically laid out their case. They presented the forensic evidence, the intelligence reports linking the suspects to Libyan intelligence, and the testimony of Tony Gaussi. The defense, in turn, attacked the credibility of every piece of evidence. They argued that the timer fragment was not unique and that other, similar timers had been sold to other countries, including East Germany. They relentlessly attacked the testimony of the shopkeeper, Tony Gaussi, pointing out that his memory had shifted over time and that his initial descriptions of the man who bought the clothes did not perfectly match Megrahi. They argued that the entire case was a flimsy, circumstantial house of cards, built by Western intelligence agencies who were determined to frame Libya for a crime it did not commit. The trial lasted for 84 days. It was presided over by a panel of 3 senior Scottish judges, who would act as both judge and jury. After weeks of deliberation, on January 31, 2001, they delivered their verdict. It was a split decision. The judges found the case against the second accused, Lumen Khalifa Fhimah, to be unproven. They ruled that while his presence in Malta was suspicious, the evidence did not definitively link him to the conspiracy. He was acquitted and walked free. But for the first accused, Abdelbasset El-Megrahi, the verdict was different. The judges found the evidence against him, while circumstantial, to be compelling enough for a conviction. They found the identification by the shopkeeper, Tony Gaussi, to be credible. They believed that Megrahi, acting as a Libyan intelligence officer, had been the one to purchase the clothes and place the bomb-laden suitcase onto the flight from Malta. They found him guilty of the murder of all 270 victims of the Lockerbie bombing. The verdict was a moment of immense, if incomplete, catharsis for the families of the victims. After 12 long years, a court of law had finally found someone guilty. Justice, it seemed, had been served. Abdelbasset El-Megrahi was sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum term of 27 years, and was sent to a Scottish prison to serve his time. But the verdict did not end the questions surrounding the Lockerbie bombing. In fact, for many it only deepened them. The case against Megrahi was far from ironclad, and the acquittal of his co-accused raised questions about the nature of the conspiracy. Was Megrahi a lone wolf, or was he part of a larger team whose other members had escaped justice? And then there was the larger, more troubling question of who had ordered the attack. Megrahi was an intelligence agent. He was a soldier, not a general. The attack on Pan Am 103 was a complex, state-sponsored act of terrorism. The order had to have come from the very highest levels of the Libyan government, from Colonel Gaddafi himself. But Gaddafi was never charged. He was never brought to trial. He remained the ghost at the center of the conspiracy, the man who had likely given the order but who had been shielded by the cloak of sovereign immunity and political pragmatism. The conviction of a single, mid-level operative felt to many like an incomplete and politically convenient form of justice. The conviction of Abdelbasset El-Megrahi, while a landmark legal achievement, failed to bring a sense of final, unambiguous closure to the Lockerbie saga. The narrative that had been so painstakingly constructed by the prosecution, a story of a Libyan intelligence plot culminating in Megrahi planting the bomb in Malta, began to be challenged almost as soon as the verdict was delivered. Doubts about the safety of the conviction lingered and grew over the years, fueled by new evidence, recanted testimony, and a host of compelling alternative theories. The foundation of the case against Megrahi rested on two critical pillars: the testimony of the Maltese shopkeeper, Tony Gaussi, who identified him as the buyer of the clothes found in the bomb bag, and the fragment of the Mebo timer circuit board that linked the bomb to Libya. Both of these pillars began to crumble under post-trial scrutiny. It was revealed that Tony Gaussi had been shown Megrahi's photograph in a magazine before he identified him in a police lineup, a clear violation of standard identification procedures that could have tainted his memory. Furthermore, it came to light that Gaussi and his brother had received a substantial reward, estimated to be around $2 million, from the U.S. government for their testimony, a fact that was not disclosed to the defense at the time of the trial. This raised serious questions about his credibility and his motivation for identifying Megrahi. The timer evidence also became deeply problematic. The owner of the Swiss firm Mebo, Edwin Bollier, would later claim that he had been pressured by the FBI to identify the fragment as one of his own timers. He testified in later inquiries that he had sold similar timers to other entities, including the Stasi, the East German secret police, and that the fragment found at Lockerbie was different from the ones he had sold to Libya. He even claimed that he had been offered millions of dollars to stick to his original story. These doubts were so significant that the Scottish Criminal Cases Review Commission, an independent body that investigates potential miscarriages of justice, reviewed Megrahi's case twice. In both instances, they found sufficient grounds to refer the case back for a new appeal, citing evidence that had not been heard at the original trial which they believed could have led to a different verdict. While the legal case against Megrahi was weakening, the political landscape was also shifting dramatically. In 2003, Colonel Gaddafi, in a stunning reversal, formally accepted Libya's responsibility for the Lockerbie bombing. He agreed to pay massive compensation, totaling $2.7 billion, to the families of the victims. He never admitted to personally ordering the attack, but his government acknowledged its role. This move was part of a larger diplomatic effort by Gaddafi to bring Libya in from the cold, to have the crippling international sanctions lifted, and to restore normal relations with the West. The admission of guilt was seen as a pragmatic, political act, but it seemed to confirm the core finding of the Camp Zeiss court, that Libya was, indeed, behind the bombing. Then, in 2009, the story took its most controversial and emotionally wrenching turn. The Scottish government announced that it was releasing Abdelbasset el-Megrahi from prison on compassionate grounds. Megrahi had been diagnosed with terminal prostate cancer, and doctors had given him just a few months to live. The decision to release him, allowing him to return to Libya to die, was met with a firestorm of outrage, particularly from the American families of the victims. They saw it as a betrayal, a capitulation to political and economic pressures, particularly rumors of a secret deal to secure oil contracts with Libya. The image of Megrahi receiving a hero's welcome upon his return to Tripoli was a source of profound pain and anger for the families who had fought so long for his conviction. The man they believed had murdered their loved ones was not going to die in a Scottish prison cell, but at home, surrounded by his family. In a final, ironic twist, Megrahi would go on to live for nearly 3 more years, dying in 2012. The legacy of the Lockerbie bombing is a vast and complicated tapestry of grief, justice, and geopolitics. It was a watershed moment in the history of terrorism, a demonstration of how a sophisticated state-sponsored actor could use a civilian airliner as a weapon of mass destruction, a chilling prelude to the even greater horrors that would come on September 11, 2001. The investigation itself was a monumental achievement, a testament to the power of international cooperation and painstaking forensic science. It set a new standard for how complex cross-border terrorism cases could be investigated. But the story of Lockerbie also remains a deeply unsettling and, for many, an unresolved mystery. The doubts about Megrahi's guilt have never been fully put to rest, and a powerful alternative theory has always lingered in the background. A theory that places the blame not on Libya, but on Iran. This theory posits that the bombing of Pan Am 103 was not an act of Libyan retribution, but an act of Iranian revenge. Just 5 months before the Lockerbie bombing in July 1988, an American naval warship, the USS Vincennes, had mistakenly shot down an Iranian civilian airliner, Iran Air Flight 655, over the Persian Gulf, killing all 290 people on board. The theory argues that Iran, seeking vengeance, hired a Syrian-based Palestinian terrorist group, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine General Command, PFLPGC, to carry out the attack. This theory is supported by initial intelligence reports from the time, which strongly pointed toward the PFLPGC. The proponents of this theory argue that the West, in a cynical act of realpolitik, shifted the blame from Iran and Syria to the more convenient and less strategically important enemy, Libya, especially as relations with Syria became crucial during the First Gulf War. The truth of who ultimately ordered and executed the bombing of Pan Am 103 may never be known with absolute certainty. The case remains a labyrinth of competing narratives, of circumstantial evidence, of recanted testimony, and of the murky, intersecting worlds of intelligence and international diplomacy. But for the families of the 270 victims, the legacy is far more personal. It is a story of a profound and unending loss, a story of a long and often frustrating fight for truth and accountability, and a story that is forever etched in the quiet, rolling hills of a small Scottish town that, on the longest night of the year, became the site of a tragedy that touched the entire world. The abduction of J.C. Dugard the morning of June 10, 1991, dawned with the clean, crisp air of early summer in the mountains. In the community of South Lake Tahoe, California, a resort town nestled against the brilliant blue of the lake and the green expanse of the pines, life was a familiar, comfortable rhythm of school days and the promise of the coming tourist season. For 11-year-old J.C. Lee Dugard, it was just another Monday, the beginning of the final week of the school year. She was a bright, happy girl, known for her love of animals, particularly her cats, and a sweet, slightly shy disposition. That morning, she got ready for school, her pink windbreaker a bright spot of color against the morning haze. Her life was a simple, protected world of childhood, a world about to be shattered in the most brutal and public way imaginable. Her stepfather, Carl Probin, stood on the front porch of their home, watching as JC made her way up the gentle slope of the street, toward her school bus stop, a walk she had made countless times before. It was a scene of perfect, unremarkable suburban normalcy. As she walked, a gray late-model sedan pulled up alongside her. Carl watched, a flicker of annoyance turning to a cold knot of dread. The car was moving too slowly, its proximity to the young girl unnatural. Then the unthinkable happened. A hand reached out from the passenger side of the car and seemed to grab JC. Carl saw a brief, violent struggle. He saw what looked like a flash, a jolt, and then JC was pulled, bundled into the car. The sedan's door slammed shut, and the car sped away, its tires squealing on the pavement. For a frozen second, Carl Probin's mind refused to process what his eyes had just seen. Then, a wave of pure, adrenalized terror washed over him. He jumped onto his mountain bike, which was leaning against the house, and began to pedal furiously, chasing after the disappearing car, screaming his stepdaughter's name into the morning air. But the car was too fast. It rounded a corner and was gone. He was left in the middle of the street, gasping for breath, the only witness to a child being stolen from the world in broad daylight. He raced back to the house and called 911. The police response was swift. The brazen nature of the crime, a daylight abduction on a quiet residential street with an adult witness, sent a shockwave through the local law enforcement community. Roadblocks were set up on the highways leading out of the Tahoe Basin. A massive, desperate search began. The investigation had a powerful, if flawed, head start. Carl Probin was a credible, articulate witness. He was able to give the police a detailed description of the car. A gray sedan, possibly a Ford or an Oldsmobile, with a damaged rear bumper. He also provided a description of the two people he had seen inside. A man driving, and a woman in the passenger seat who had helped pull JC in. This detail was particularly strange. Kidnappings involving a female accomplice were rare. He also described the driver as a white male with long, dark hair and a beard. From his description, a composite sketch was created and immediately circulated to the media. The search for JC Dugard became a national story. Her smiling school picture was everywhere, on television screens, on the front page of newspapers, on missing child flyers that were stapled to telephone poles and taped to the windows of gas stations and grocery stores across the country. The story was terrifying because of its sheer, random audacity. If a child could be snatched from a quiet street in a safe neighborhood, then no child anywhere was truly safe. The investigation, led by the El Dorado County Sheriff's Office with assistance from the FBI, was intense. They followed up on thousands of tips. They searched the vast, rugged wilderness around Lake Tahoe, fearing the worst, that JC's body had been dumped in the dense forest. But they found nothing. As is so often the case in these tragedies, the initial suspicion of the police soon began to turn inward, toward the family itself. Carl Probin, the sole witness, was subjected to intense, repeated, and often accusatory interrogations. The police found his story almost too incredible to be believed. They put him through lie detector tests and hypnosis sessions, searching for any inconsistency, any sign of deception. They theorized that perhaps he had been involved in a dispute, that the abduction was a form of revenge or a deal gone wrong. For Carl Probin and JC's mother, Terry, the agony of their loss was now compounded by the torment of being treated as suspects. The public, too, began to whisper, their sympathy curdling into suspicion. The man who had desperately tried to save his stepdaughter was now being implicitly accused of her disappearance. But Carl Probin's story never wavered. He stuck to his account with a desperate, frustrated consistency. The police, despite their suspicions, could find no evidence to tie him to the crime. The tips that had flooded in the first few days began to dry up. The roadblocks came down. The massive search parties were disbanded. The case, which had begun with such a jolt of violent public clarity, now began to fade into a long, agonizing silence. The months turned into years. The bright, hopeful face of JC Dugard on the missing posters began to fade in the sun. The national media moved on to other stories, other tragedies. For the world, the case of JC Dugard became another sad, unsolved mystery, another name in the long, sorrowful litany of stolen children. But for her family, time did not move on. They were frozen in a state of suspended grief, a permanent limbo of not knowing. Was she alive? Was she dead? The not knowing was a special kind of torture, a wound that could never scar over, because it was reopened with every passing birthday, every holiday, every time they saw a girl on the street with the same color hair. For 18 years, the case remained cold. It was a ghost story, a cautionary tale told to children in the Tahoe area about the danger of talking to strangers. For 18 years, the world assumed that J.C. Dugard was long dead, another victim of a faceless monster who had simply gotten away with it. But for 18 years, the truth was something far stranger, far more complex, and in many ways, far more horrifying. J.C. Dugard was not dead. She was alive, and she was living in a secret, hidden world, just a few hours' drive away. A prisoner in a backyard compound, the mother of 2 children whose father was the very man who had stolen her from the world. The greatest mystery was not what had happened to J.C. Dugard, but the new life and the new person she had been forced to become. The gray sedan that sped away from the South Lake Tahoe bus stop on that June morning carried J.C. Dugard into a new and terrifying reality, a world so completely divorced from her own that it might as well have been another planet. The man behind the wheel was Philip Garrido. He was 40 years old, a man with a long and disturbing criminal history of drug and sex offenses. He was, at that very moment, on federal parole for a brutal 1976 kidnapping and rape, a fact that should have placed him under the strictest supervision. The woman in the passenger seat, the one who had helped pull J.C. into the car, was his wife, Nancy Garrido, a woman whose own psychology was so deeply enmeshed with her husband's that she had become the willing accomplice in his darkest compulsions. The weapon that had subdued J.C. was not a gun or a knife, but a stun gun, a jolt of high-voltage electricity that had paralyzed her small body with a pain so intense and so alien it had short-circuited her ability to scream. In the back of the car, hidden under a blanket, her world shrank to the smell of gasoline, the rumble of the engine, and the low, murmuring voices of her captors. They were beginning the slow, insidious process of her indoctrination, erasing her old life and creating a new one. They told her that Philip was her new man, that she belonged to them now, that her life as J.C. Dugard was over. Their destination was a modest, unassuming house on a quiet suburban street in the town of Antioch, a working-class community in the East Bay, about 170 miles and a world away from J.C.'s home. But J.C. would not be living in the house. Her new home was in the backyard. The Garrido's property was a strange, cluttered maze, a hoarder's landscape of junk, dilapidated sheds, overgrown weeds, and a series of high, solid fences. It was a secret kingdom of squalor and confinement, hidden in plain sight from the neighbors who lived just feet away, their own tidy lawns and suburban lives a universe away from the horror being constructed next door. In this backyard, Philip Garrido had built a prison. It was a hidden compound within a compound, a series of ramshackle sheds and tents, their interiors soundproofed with cheap insulation and carpet remnants, creating a tomb-like silence. For the first few years of her captivity, J.C. was kept in a state of almost total isolation, a ghost in her own backyard prison. She was handcuffed and at times chained to a concrete slab. The physical confinement was absolute. But the true chains, the ones that would hold her for 18 years, were the psychological ones that Garrido began to forge from the very first day. He was not just her captor, he was her rapist. The relentless, daily sexual assault was not just an act of violence. It was the primary tool of his control, a way to establish absolute power, to shatter her sense of self, and to bind her to him through a shared, terrible intimacy. But the psychological manipulation was even more systematic and insidious. Garrido, a man who saw himself as a religious prophet with a direct line to God, began a long-term campaign to colonize her mind. He created a powerful, terrifying mythology to keep her compliant. He told her that he was part of a massive, secret, and powerful organization that was watching her every move. He claimed there were cameras and sensors hidden all around her, that the organization could hear everything she said, and that if she ever tried to escape or cry out for help, they would not only find her and kill her, but they would also find and kill her family in South Lake Tahoe. The threat was a constant, terrifying presence, a psychological wall that was far more effective than any physical one. It turned her love for her family into a weapon against her own freedom. He filled her head with his own bizarre, rambling philosophy, a strange, incoherent mixture of religious fervor and paranoid delusion. He forced her to read from his angel diaries, a series of nonsensical, stream of consciousness writings about his ability to control sound with his mind and to communicate with angels through a special device he had invented. He was creating a new religion, a new reality with himself at its center as the Messiah, and she was to be his first and most important disciple. The world outside the fence, the world of her mother, her school, her friends, her own name, began to feel distant, unreal, like a story she had read in a book long ago. The only reality was the backyard, the sheds, the chains, and the absolute, unquestionable power of the man who controlled her mind. Nancy Garrido, for her part, was not a fellow prisoner. She was the warden. She facilitated her husband's abuse, acting as his enforcer and his accomplice. It was Nancy who brought JC food, who managed her daily existence, and who reinforced Philip's bizarre teachings. She was a strange, complex figure, both a victim of her husband's domineering personality and a perpetrator of unimaginable cruelty against a child. She was the female face that had made the initial abduction possible, the presence that had lowered JC's guard, and she was now the daily, female presence that normalized the horror of her new life. As the years passed in the suffocating confinement of the backyard, the lines of JC's old identity began to blur and fade completely. Then, at the age of 14, 3 years into her captivity, a new and life-altering horror occurred. JC gave birth to a daughter. She delivered the baby in the squalor of the backyard, with only Philip and Nancy there to assist. The birth was a profoundly traumatic and transformative event. She was a child herself, forced to become a mother in the most horrific of circumstances. Her daughter was the child of her rapist, a living, breathing symbol of her unending nightmare. But the baby was also hers. In the midst of the horror, a new, powerful, and fiercely protective instinct was born. Her love for her child became her new anchor, her new reason to endure. 3 years later, she gave birth to a second daughter. JC was now a mother of 2, still just a teenager. Herself. The presence of the children changed the strange, toxic dynamic of the backyard prison. They became a part of the Garrido's twisted fantasy of a family. Philip and Nancy became the doting grandparents. JC, who the children knew only as their mother, was given a new role, and with it, a new, more complex set of psychological chains. She was no longer just a captive. She was a mother, responsible for the well-being of 2 small, innocent girls who had never known any other world. The thought of escape, which had already been suppressed by years of fear and indoctrination, was now unthinkable. How could she escape with 2 small children? And if she left them behind, what would happen to them? Her love for her daughters became the final, most powerful lock on her cage. For years, this perverse family lived in their secret world. The girls were homeschooled by JC, their education a strange mixture of normal childhood lessons and Philip Garrido's bizarre religious teachings. They had cats, they had toys, they had a mother who loved them with a fierce, desperate love. But their world was a prison of sheds and tents, their sky circumscribed by a high wooden fence. They had no idea that their own mother was a missing child, her face on a faded poster in a distant town. They had no idea that the man they knew as their father was her kidnapper and her rapist. They knew only the reality they had been born into. And JC, the young girl from Lake Tahoe, was now a woman, her identity so completely subsumed by her roles as captive and mother that the memory of the person she used to be was almost gone, a ghost from a life that no longer felt real. For 18 years, the secret world of Philip Garrido's backyard remained sealed, a testament to the shocking failure of the very systems that were supposed to prevent such a thing from happening. Garrido was a convicted felon on federal parole for kidnapping and rape. He was supposed to be under the close supervision of a parole officer, a man whose job it was to monitor his activities, to visit his home, and to ensure he was not a danger to the community. But for nearly 2 decades, this system failed catastrophically. Garrido's parole officers, a succession of them over the years, conducted their visits, but their scrutiny was shockingly superficial. They would meet with Garrido in the front part of his house, but they never conducted a thorough search of the backyard. The high fences, the strange assortment of sheds and tents, the cluttered, junkyard-like appearance of the property. It was all dismissed as the eccentricities of a strange, but seemingly harmless man. Garrido was a master manipulator, and he used his bizarre religious fervor as a kind of shield. He would speak to his parole officers about his newfound faith, about the church he was trying to start, about his ability to speak to angels. They saw him as a kook, a harmless religious nut, not as a dangerous sexual predator who was holding a young woman and 2 children captive just a few feet away. On at least one occasion, a parole officer heard the sound of children's voices coming from the backyard, but Garrido explained them away as his brother's kids who were visiting. The explanation was accepted without question. The system that was supposed to be his leash had become his enabler. The secret was also kept by a wall of neighborhood indifference. The Garridos were the strange people on the block, the ones with the messy yard and the high fences. Neighbors heard strange noises. They saw the tents, but no one ever thought to investigate further. It was a classic case of suburban anonymity, of people choosing not to get involved, to not see what was happening right next door. But as the years went on, Philip Garrido's delusions of grandeur grew. He was no longer content to be a prophet in his own backyard. He wanted to take his message to the world. He started a blog, God's Desire, filled with his rambling, incoherent manifestos. He began to see himself as a major public figure, a man with an important message to share, and this growing messianic complex, this need for public validation, would ultimately be his undoing. In 2009, Garrido decided he needed to hold a public event to promote his new church. He went to the campus of the University of California, Berkeley, a place known for its tolerance of eccentrics and street preachers. With him, he brought 2 young women, the 2 daughters he had fathered with JC. He was trying to get a permit from the campus police department to hold a God's Desire event. The campus police officer he spoke with, a woman named Lisa Campbell, was immediately struck by his bizarre behavior and the strange, almost robotic demeanor of the 2 young girls with him. They seemed pale, subdued, and utterly disconnected from the world around them. Officer Campbell was so unsettled by the encounter that she ran a background check on Philip Garrido. The results came back immediately. He was a registered sex offender on federal parole. This was a massive red flag. Her instincts told her that something was deeply wrong. She contacted Garrido's federal parole officer, a man named Ed Santos, who had only recently been assigned to the case. Santos was equally alarmed. He had been trying to get a handle on Garrido, who had been violating the terms of his parole by not reporting his employment. The call from the UC Berkeley police was the final straw. Santos ordered Philip Garrido to report to the parole office in Concord the very next day, and he was to bring his wife, Nancy, and the 2 young women who had been with him on the campus. On August 26, 2009, the final act of the long, strange saga began. Philip and Nancy Garrido arrived at the parole office. With them were the 2 girls who gave their names as Angel and Starlet. Also with them was a 3rd woman, a quiet, pale woman with long blonde hair, who introduced herself as Alyssa. This was JC Dugard. She was now 29 years old. Parole officer Ed Santos began the meeting. He questioned Philip Garrido about his activities, about his business, about the 2 girls. Garrido's answers were rambling and evasive. The behavior of the 3 women was even more bizarre. They were passive, their answers monosyllabic, their eyes downcast. They seemed to be completely under Garrido's control. Santos, his suspicions now at a fever pitch, separated the group. He took Philip Garrido into one room for questioning. He had another officer take Nancy and the 2 girls into a separate room, and he asked a 3rd officer to speak with the woman who called herself Alyssa. Alone with the parole officer, Alyssa was at first resistant. Her conditioning was deep. For 18 years, she had been taught that the outside world was a danger, that the police could not be trusted, and that her survival and the survival of her daughters depended on her loyalty to Philip Garrido. She stuck to the story she had been taught, that she was a family friend, that the girls were Philip's. But the parole officer was patient and persistent. He sensed her fear and her conflict. He gently pushed, asking her questions about her past, about where she was from. And slowly, painstakingly, the walls that had been built around her mind for 18 years began to crumble. He asked her real name. She hesitated. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, the words finally came out. "My name," she said, "is J.C. Dugard." The name was a thunderclap. The parole officer, who had been a young man when J.C. had disappeared, immediately recognized it. He knew the story. He knew the faded poster. He was face to face with a ghost. The missing girl from Lake Tahoe, the child the world had long ago given up for dead, was sitting in front of him, alive. The truth came out in a flood. J.C. told them everything. The abduction, the backyard prison, the years of abuse, the 2 daughters. The El Dorado County Sheriff's Office was contacted immediately. They sent a detective who had worked the original case, a man who had been haunted by her face for nearly 2 decades. He arrived, and the reunion was a moment of profound, almost unbelievable emotional release. The long, cold case was not cold anymore. It was burning hot. The same day, J.C. was reunited with her mother, Terry. The reunion, after 18 years of separation and unimaginable trauma, was a testament to the enduring, unbreakable bond between a mother and a daughter. J.C.'s sister, who had been just a baby when she was taken, was now a young woman. The family that had been frozen in grief for so long was suddenly, miraculously, whole again. The news of her discovery was a global sensation. It was a story so incredible, so filled with horror and hope, that it seemed to belong to the world of fiction, not to a quiet suburban street in Antioch. The world celebrated the miracle of her return, but it also recoiled in horror at the story of the life she had been forced to live. And a new, more troubling set of questions began to be asked. How could this have happened? How could a girl be held captive in a backyard for 18 years, just feet away from her neighbors? And how could a man on federal parole, a man who was supposed to be one of the most closely watched criminals in the system, have gotten away with it for so long? The discovery of J.C. Dugard and her 2 daughters, and the arrest of Philip and Nancy Garrido, set off a firestorm of public outrage and a period of intense institutional soul-searching. The case was a shocking indictment of the multiple systems that were supposed to protect children and monitor dangerous offenders. The story of J.C.'s survival was a miracle, but it was a miracle that had been necessitated by a catastrophic, decades-long failure of law enforcement and social services. The primary focus of the outrage was the parole system. How could a man, like Philip Garrido, a convicted rapist and kidnapper, have been allowed to operate with such impunity for so long? The investigation into his parole history revealed a pattern of systemic neglect and incompetence. His parole officers had failed to conduct thorough searches of his property, had accepted his bizarre, nonsensical explanations at face value, and had missed dozens of red flags that should have triggered a more intensive investigation. The case exposed the dangerous reality of an overburdened and under-resourced parole system, where officers with massive caseloads were often unable to provide the kind of rigorous supervision that high-risk offenders require. The California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation was forced to launch a top-to-bottom review of its policies and procedures for monitoring paroled sex offenders. The local police also came under fire. It was revealed that in 2006, 3 years before J.C. was discovered, one of the Garrido's neighbors had made a 911 call. The neighbor reported that Philip Garrido was living with young children in the tents in his backyard, and that he seemed to be running some kind of religious cult. A sheriff's deputy was dispatched to the house, but he left after a brief conversation at the front door, having never entered the backyard. He reported that he found no evidence of any wrongdoing. It was a single critical moment, a missed opportunity that could have ended J.C.'s ordeal 3 years sooner. The legal proceedings against Philip and Nancy Garrido were swift. Faced with an overwhelming mountain of evidence and the powerful, undeniable testimony of J.C. herself, they knew they had no chance at trial. To spare J.C. and her daughters the trauma of having to testify in open court, a plea bargain was reached. In April 2011, Philip Garrido pleaded guilty to kidnapping and multiple counts of rape. He was sentenced to 431 years to life in prison. Nancy Garrido, in a separate plea, pleaded guilty to kidnapping and rape and was sentenced to 36 years to life. They would both die behind bars. For J.C. Dugard, the journey of healing and recovery was a long and profoundly difficult one. She had been stolen from the world at the age of 11 and had returned to it at the age of 29. She had to relearn how to live in a world that was not defined by fear and confinement. She had to reconnect with a family that had become strangers to her. And she had to help her two daughters, who had been born into captivity, understand the truth of their own origins and navigate a world they had never known. But in the years following her rescue, J.C. Dugard demonstrated a resilience and a strength that was nothing short of heroic. She and her daughters entered into intensive therapy. They were reunited with their family, slowly and carefully building new bonds of love and trust. And J.C., the girl who had been silenced for so long, found her voice. In 2011, she published a memoir, A Stolen Life. The book was a raw, unflinching, and powerfully honest account of her 18 years in captivity. It was a worldwide bestseller, and it gave her control of her own story for the first time. She was no longer just a victim in a sensational news story. She was the author of her own narrative, a survivor who was telling her truth in her own words. She also became a powerful advocate for other victims of trauma. She started the JAYC Foundation, Just Ask Yourself to Care, an organization dedicated to supporting families who have experienced abduction and other traumatic events. She used the platform that her tragic story had given her to create something positive, to help others find a path to healing. The legacy of the J.C. Dugard case is a complex and enduring one. It is a story that reveals the darkest depths of human depravity, but it is also a story that showcases the incredible, almost unbelievable, resilience of the human spirit. It serves as a permanent, chilling reminder of the monsters that can hide in plain sight, in quiet suburban neighborhoods, behind ordinary-looking fences. And it stands as a powerful indictment of the systemic failures that can allow such horrors to occur. A case study in the tragic consequences of a parole system that fails to monitor, a police force that fails to investigate, and a community that fails to see. But ultimately, the story of J.C. Dugard is not about Philip Garrido. It is about her. It is a story of a life that was stolen but not destroyed. It is a testament to the power of a mother's love to endure in the most unimaginable of circumstances. And it is the story of a young woman who emerged from 18 years of darkness and, instead of being consumed by it, chose to step into the light and use her voice to create a new life, a new identity, and a new future, not as a victim, but as a survivor, a mother, and a powerful, inspiring symbol of hope. The murder of Hae Min Lee in the final year of the 20th century. The world of Woodlawn High School in Baltimore County, Maryland, was a universe unto itself, a bustling microcosm of late 90s American teenage life. It was a world of beepers and dial-up internet, of baggy jeans and hip-hop music, a place where the social hierarchies were as complex and as rigid as any ancient caste system. It was a world of varsity sports, of after-school jobs at the local mall, of frantic studying for SATs, and of the intense, all-consuming drama of first love. It was a world that felt, for the most part, safe and predictable, its rhythms dictated by the ringing of school bells and the promise of the weekend. And at the vibrant, thriving center of this world was a young woman named Hae Min Lee. At 18 years old, Hae was the embodiment of the successful, first-generation American dream. Her family had immigrated from South Korea, and she navigated the complex cultural landscape with a grace and an energy that was magnetic. She was a brilliant student, a member of the honor roll, and a gifted athlete who played on the school's varsity lacrosse and field hockey teams. She was ambitious, with dreams of one day becoming an optometrist. But she was not just a diligent student. She was full of life, a girl with a radiant smile, a mischievous sense of humor, and a deep loyalty to her wide circle of friends. Her diary, a window into her world, was filled with the familiar hopes, anxieties, and passions of a teenage girl. Her frustrations with her traditional family's strict rules, her love for her friends, and the soaring, dramatic highs and lows of her first serious romance. That romance was with a young man who was, in many ways, her male counterpart in the school's social firmament. His name was Adnan Syed. Adnan was also a popular, well-liked senior. He was a star on the football team, an honor roll student, and the homecoming king. He was handsome, charming, and charismatic, the golden boy of his own immigrant family from Pakistan. Their relationship was a classic, intense high school love affair, but it was one that was fraught with the cultural tensions of their backgrounds. They were forced to keep their relationship a secret from their conservative Muslim and Korean families, a fact that added a layer of forbidden, romantic drama to their lives. They would meet in secret, pass notes between classes, and talk for hours on the phone late at night. Their love was deep, passionate, and, like so many first loves, ultimately tumultuous. After a year together, the relationship ended, a breakup that was, by all accounts, emotional but not acrimonious. They remained friends, still moving in the same social circles, their lives still deeply intertwined in the small, interconnected world of Woodlawn High. By January of 1999, Hay had a new boyfriend, a young man named Don who worked with her at a local lens crafters. Adnan, for his part, was moving on as well. January 13th, 1999, was a perfectly ordinary Wednesday. It was the middle of the school week, a day of classes, of hurried lunches in the cafeteria, of after-school activities. Heyman Lee went through her day with her usual energy. She went to her classes. She chatted with friends. She bought a snack from the concession stand after school. She had a simple and very important plan for the afternoon. She had to pick up her 6-year-old cousin from her elementary school. This was a responsibility she took very seriously. She was, by every account, a deeply reliable and punctual person. She was never late to pick up her cousin, ever. Sometime after 2:15 p.m., Hay left Woodlawn High School. She was seen by several friends, and it was assumed she was heading to her car, a gray 1998 Nissan Sentra, to begin her short journey to the daycare. It was the last time anyone who knew her would ever see her alive. The first sign that something was wrong came around 3:15 p.m. Hay's family received a call from the elementary school. Hay's cousin was still there, waiting. Hay had never arrived. A small knot of worry in her family's stomach immediately began to tighten into a cold, hard ball of fear. This was not like her. This was not right. They began to call her friends. No one had seen her. They called her new boyfriend, Don. He was at work at Lens Crafters and hadn't heard from her. The family contacted the police to report her missing. The initial police response was, as it often is in the case of a missing teenager, somewhat muted. They considered the possibility that she was a runaway, that she had simply taken off with her new boyfriend. But this narrative didn't fit the person her family and friends described. She was not a troubled girl. She had a job, she had plans, she had a deep sense of responsibility. And most importantly, she had left without taking any of her belongings. Her room was untouched. She had simply vanished. The police began their investigation, and one of the first people they called, as is standard procedure, was the ex-boyfriend. At 6:24 p.m. that evening, a police officer called Adnan Syed's cell phone. Adnan was cooperative. He told the officer that he had seen Hay at school that day, that they had spoken briefly, but that he hadn't seen her after school. He said he had gone to track practice, as he did every day. He sounded, by all accounts, like a concerned friend. For the next few weeks, the search for Heyman Lee continued. Her family and friends posted missing flyers, their hearts growing heavier with each passing day. The police followed up on leads, but there was nothing. Her car was gone. There was no ransom note. There was no sign of a struggle. It was as if she had driven away from her high school and had simply been erased from the face of the earth. The agonizing mystery came to a brutal and heartbreaking end 4 weeks later. On February 9th, 1999, a man walking through Leakin Park, a large, heavily wooded area on the west side of Baltimore with a dark local reputation as a dumping ground for bodies, noticed something strange. About 100 feet off a secluded path, partially buried under a thin layer of soil and leaves, he saw what looked like a shock of dark human hair. He called the police. The body they unearthed was that of Heyman Lee. She had been manually strangled. The cause of death was intimate, personal, and violent. The mystery of a missing girl had now become a full-blown homicide investigation. The police had a victim, they had a cause of death, but they had no crime scene. Her car was still missing, and no clear suspect. The search for "Where is Hay?" was over. The far more difficult and darker search for "Who killed Hay?" had just begun. And in that search, the eyes of the law would soon turn, with an intense and unwavering focus, back to the charming, popular homecoming king who had been her first love. With the discovery of Hay Min Lee's body, the Baltimore County Police Department now had a homicide case on its hands, and the pressure to solve it was immense. The investigation, which had been a relatively low-intensity missing person case, now kicked into high gear. They had no physical evidence from the burial site in Leakin Park, no murder weapon, and no crime scene. As Hay's gray Nissan Sentra was still missing, the detectives were left with a single, crucial task: to reconstruct the timeline of the day Hay disappeared, to figure out what had happened to her in the hours between when she left Woodlawn High School and when her body was dumped in the park. Their investigation quickly led them back to the person who knew Hay best, the person who had been the center of her world for the past year. Her ex-boyfriend, Adnan Syed. They began to interview their shared circle of friends, and a new, more complicated picture of Adnan and Hay's relationship began to emerge. It was not the simple, friendly breakup that had been initially described. Friends told the police that Adnan had been deeply hurt and possessive after the breakup, that he was having a hard time letting go. This provided the police with something they had been desperately lacking: a motive, the classic, tragic story of a spurned lover, a young man whose wounded pride and jealousy had curdled into a murderous rage. While this theory was taking shape, the investigation got its first major break. On February 12th, just 3 days after Hay's body was found, the police received an anonymous phone call. The caller, a young man, told them to look at Adnan Syed as the primary suspect, and he told them to talk to a mutual friend of Adnan and Hay, a young woman named Jennifer Jen Pusateri. The police brought Jen in for questioning. At first, she was evasive, her story changing several times. But under the pressure of the interrogation, she finally broke down and told the police a story that would become the central pillar of the entire case against Adnan Syed. She said that on the night of January 13th, the day Hay disappeared, she had received a call from her friend, a quirky, small-time drug dealer and local ne'er-do-well named Jay Wilds. She said that Jay had told her a horrifying story, that Adnan Syed had killed Hay Min Lee. According to Jen, Jay told her that Adnan had strangled Hay in the parking lot of a Best Buy and had shown him her body in the trunk of her car. He had then asked for Jay's help in burying her. Jen told the police that later that evening, Jay had come to her house, and together, they had disposed of the shovels and some of Jay's clothes in a dumpster. Jen's story was a bombshell. It was the first direct, eyewitness account that implicated Adnan Syed in the murder, and it gave the police their star witness, Jay Wilds. The police brought Jay in for questioning, and over the course of 2 long, recorded interrogations, he laid out the narrative that would be used to convict Adnan Syed. His story was detailed, dramatic, and damning. He told the police that on the morning of January 13th, Adnan had given him his brand new cell phone and his car, telling him to be available for a call later that afternoon. Jay said that Adnan had been stewing over the breakup and had spoken of his desire to kill Hay. Then, at around 3:30 p.m., the call came. Adnan told Jay to come and get him from the Best Buy parking lot. When Jay arrived, he said, Adnan opened the trunk of Hay's car, and inside he saw her body. She was pale, her neck bruised. Adnan, according to Jay, was proud, almost boastful of what he had done. "I think I did it," he allegedly said. "I think I killed her." Jay then described a long, strange afternoon and evening. He said he and Adnan had driven around for a while, had gone to a friend's house, had smoked some marijuana, all while Hay's body was still in the trunk of her car. Finally, as darkness fell, he said he helped Adnan dig a shallow grave in Leakin Park and bury Hay's body. He then helped him dump her car in a secluded lot. Jay's story provided the police with a complete, coherent, and terrifying narrative of the crime. It gave them a timeline, a location for the murder, and a confession from the killer himself. And most importantly, it was a story that could be corroborated, at least in part, by a crucial piece of objective evidence: the records from Adnan Syed's cell phone. The cell phone records for January 13th showed a series of incoming and outgoing calls that seemed to perfectly match the key moments in Jay's story. There were calls that placed the phone in the vicinity of Woodlawn High School, calls that seemed to correspond with the time of the murder, and, most damningly, a series of calls in the evening that pinged off a cell phone tower located near Leakin Park, the very place where Hayes' body had been buried. The cell phone data seemed to be the independent, scientific proof that Jay Wilds was telling the truth, that Adnan Syed had been in Leakin Park on the night of the murder. There were, however, significant problems and inconsistencies in Jay's story. His account of the timeline shifted dramatically between his first and second police interviews. The details of where and when he saw the body, what they did that afternoon, and the timing of the burial all changed. He was also a known drug dealer with a criminal record, a fact that made him a less than ideal star witness. And his own involvement in the crime, assisting in the burial of a body, was a serious felony for which he was offered an incredibly lenient plea deal in exchange for his testimony. But for the police and the prosecution, these were minor details. They had their story and they had their man. On February 28, 1999, just 2 weeks after Hayes' body was found, 17-year-old Adnan Syed was arrested at his home in the early morning hours. He was charged with the first-degree murder of his ex-girlfriend, Hae Min Lee. The arrest of the popular, handsome honor student sent a shockwave through the community of Woodlawn High. His friends were stunned, unable to reconcile the charming, gentle boy they knew with the cold-blooded killer the police were describing. Adnan himself was adamant. He was innocent. He had no memory of the specifics of that day. It had been a completely ordinary day, 6 weeks in the past. But he knew he had not killed Hae. He had an alibi, he claimed. He had been at track practice after school. He had been at the mosque for evening prayers. But his alibi was shaky. No one could definitively say they had seen him at the exact time the state claimed the murder had occurred, in the hour after school let out. And he had a star witness, a friend, who was prepared to testify that he had confessed to the crime. The case was now set for trial. It would be a battle of two conflicting narratives: the state's story of a jealous, obsessive lover who had committed a crime of passion, and the defense's story of a wrongfully accused young man, the victim of a manipulative liar and a flawed police investigation. The key to it all would be the testimony of Jay Wilds, and the jury's decision about who and what to believe. The legal battle that followed the arrest of Adnan Syed was a protracted and complex affair. His first trial, which began in late 1999, ended in a mistrial after just 3 days. The jury had accidentally overheard the judge calling Adnan's lead defense attorney, Cristina Gutierrez, a liar, a comment that irreparably prejudiced the proceedings. The stage was now set for a second trial, one that would be longer, more contentious, and would ultimately determine the course of Adnan Syed's life. The second trial began in early 2000. The prosecution, led by Assistant State's Attorney Kevin Urich, presented a case that was almost entirely built on the testimony of their star witness, Jay Wilds. On the stand, Jay was a compelling, if somewhat nervous, witness. He recounted his dramatic story for the jury, detailing Adnan's alleged confession, the sight of Hae's body in the trunk of the car, and his own unwilling participation in the burial. He was the narrative heart of the state's case, the only person who could connect Adnan directly to the crime. To bolster Jay's testimony, the prosecution presented the cell phone records from Adnan's phone on the day of the murder. An expert witness from AT&T testified about the science of cell tower technology, explaining how the location of a phone could be roughly determined by the specific cell tower it pinged off of when making or receiving a call. He showed the jury a map, pointing to the two crucial incoming calls that had pinged off a tower located in the Leakin Park area on the evening of January 13th. This, the prosecution argued, was the objective scientific proof that corroborated Jay's story. It was the smoking gun that placed Adnan Syed at the burial site at the exact time Jay said they were there. The defense, led by the formidable but increasingly troubled Cristina Gutierrez, fought back fiercely. Her strategy was to dismantle the credibility of Jay Wilds. She relentlessly cross-examined him, highlighting the numerous, glaring inconsistencies between his initial police statements and his trial testimony. She pointed out that the timeline he presented had changed multiple times. She emphasized his criminal background as a drug dealer and argued that he had a powerful motive to lie. He was a confessed accessory to murder who had been given an incredibly lenient plea deal, no jail time at all, in exchange for his testimony against Adnan. Gutierrez argued that Jay was the one with something to hide, that he was likely more involved in the murder than he was letting on, and that he had crafted a story to pin the blame on Adnan to save himself. She portrayed Adnan as the victim, a smart, popular, and gentle young man with no history of violence, who was being framed by a manipulative liar. But there was a critical and ultimately fatal flaw in the defense's case: the alibi. Adnan had maintained from the beginning that he was likely at school, and then at track practice, during the time the state claimed the murder occurred. But his memory of the day was hazy, and Gutierrez was never able to produce a single definitive witness who could state, under oath, that they had been with Adnan for the entire crucial period between 2:15 p.m. and 3:30 p.m. Most damagingly, there was a potential alibi witness who was never called to testify. A young woman named Asia McLean, a classmate of Adnan and Hay, had written 2 letters to Adnan in prison shortly after his arrest. In those letters, she stated that she had seen Adnan in the Woodlawn Public Library, which was right next to the high school, on the afternoon of January 13th, at the exact time he was supposedly committing the murder. She claimed they had a friendly 15 to 20-minute conversation. Her testimony could have single-handedly destroyed the state's timeline of the crime. But for reasons that remain a subject of intense debate, Cristina Gutierrez and her defense team never contacted Asia McLean. They never investigated her claim. She was never called to the stand. The alibi that could have potentially freed Adnan Syed was never heard by the jury. After a 6-week trial, the case went to the jury. They were left to weigh 2 conflicting stories with no physical evidence, no DNA, no fingerprints, to definitively tie Adnan to the crime. They had to decide whether to believe the inconsistent but detailed testimony of a confessed accessory, a story that was seemingly backed up by the cell phone data, or to believe the protestations of a charismatic defendant whose own alibi was full of holes. The jury deliberated for just over 2 hours. On February 25, 2000, they returned their verdict. They found Adnan Syed guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and robbery. Adnan, who was just 18 years old, was sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years. The verdict was a triumph for the prosecution and a source of profound relief for Hae Min Lee's grieving family. Justice, they felt, had been served. The case was closed. Adnan Syed was sent away to a maximum security prison, and the story of the murdered high school girl and her jealous ex-boyfriend faded from the public consciousness. Another tragic but seemingly resolved chapter in the annals of Baltimore crime. For the next 14 years, Adnan Syed sat in prison, maintaining his innocence to anyone who would listen. He filed appeals, but they were all denied. His case was, for all intents and purposes, over. He was destined to be another forgotten man, growing old and dying behind bars for a crime he claimed he did not commit. But in 2014, the case of Adnan Syed was about to be resurrected in a way that no one could have possibly imagined. A journalist and radio producer named Sarah Koenig, who had been contacted by a family friend of the Syeds, decided to reinvestigate the case for a new, experimental form of long-form audio storytelling. The show was called Serial. It was a podcast, a new and still niche medium at the time. Koenig and her team spent a year digging through the old case files, re-interviewing the witnesses, and questioning every aspect of the original investigation and trial. They presented their findings week by week, in a serialized, episodic format that was as gripping and as addictive as any television drama. The podcast was a global phenomenon. It was downloaded by hundreds of millions of people around the world, becoming the most popular podcast in history. It transformed a forgotten local murder case into an international obsession. For the first time, the public was able to hear the story not just from the prosecution's point of view, but from Adnan's as well. They heard his voice from a prison phone, his calm, intelligent, and persistent claims of innocence. They heard the inconsistencies in Jay's story laid bare. They learned about the alibi witness, Asia McLean, who was never called. And they were introduced to a whole new set of questions and doubts that had been buried for over a decade. The case of Adnan Syed was no longer closed. It had been blown wide open, and a new, powerful, and deeply divided jury, the jury of the entire world, was now in session. The unprecedented success of the Serial podcast did more than just create a new generation of armchair detectives. It had a profound and tangible impact on the legal case itself. The intense public scrutiny that the podcast brought to the case breathed new life into Adnan Syed's long-dormant appeals process. A new legal team, led by a tenacious attorney named Rabia Chaudhry, the family friend who had first brought the case to Sarah Koenig, and later joined by prominent defense attorney C. Justin Brown, began to build a new case for Adnan, armed with the evidence and the questions that Serial had brought to light. Their new appeal centered on two key arguments. The first was the issue of ineffective assistance of counsel. They argued that Adnan's original defense attorney, Cristina Gutierrez, who had died in 2004, had provided a constitutionally deficient defense. The primary evidence for this claim was her failure to contact the alibi witness, Asia McLean. They presented affidavits from McLean, who swore that she had been willing and able to testify in 2000 and that her account of seeing Adnan in the library was true. They argued that Gutierrez's failure to even investigate this credible alibi witness was a catastrophic error that had cost Adnan his freedom. The second, and more complex, part of their appeal focused on the cell phone tower evidence, the scientific smoking gun, that the prosecution had used to place Adnan in Leakin Park. The new defense team uncovered a crucial piece of information that had been overlooked in the original trial. A fax cover sheet from AT&T that had been included with the cell phone records provided to the police. This cover sheet contained a warning, a disclaimer from AT&T itself, which stated that the location data for incoming calls was notoriously unreliable and should not be used for pinpointing a phone's location. This was a bombshell. The two crucial calls that had placed Adnan's phone near Leakin Park, the calls that had sealed his fate with the jury, were both incoming calls. The prosecution's own expert witness had relied on this flawed data, and neither he nor the defense had ever mentioned the AT&T disclaimer to the jury. The scientific evidence that had been presented as ironclad was, in fact, built on a foundation of sand. This new evidence was powerful enough to work its way through the appellate courts. In 2016, a judge granted Adnan Syed a new trial, a stunning victory that was a direct result of the issues raised by the podcast. The legal battle continued for several more years, with the state of Maryland appealing the decision. But the momentum had shifted. The official narrative was no longer the only one. The final, dramatic twist in the case came in September of 2022. The Baltimore City State's Attorney's Office, which had inherited the case and had begun its own reinvestigation, filed a motion to vacate Adnan Syed's conviction. In their motion, they revealed that they had uncovered new evidence that had never been disclosed to the defense at the time of the original trial. This evidence pointed to two other potential suspects in the murder of Hae Min Lee. One of these suspects had allegedly threatened to kill Hae. Both had criminal records, and one was later convicted of a series of sexual assaults. This information, which the original prosecutors had been aware of but had failed to turn over, was a profound violation of Adnan's constitutional rights. On September 19, 2022, after spending 23 years in prison for a crime he always maintained he did not commit, Adnan Syed walked out of the courthouse a free man. A judge had overturned his conviction, ruling that the state had violated its legal obligation to share exculpatory evidence with the defense. The city of Baltimore was given 30 days to decide whether to retry him or to drop the charges completely. A few weeks later, they announced their decision. All charges against Adnan Syed were dropped. He was, in the eyes of the law, an innocent man. The legacy of the Adnan Syed case is a powerful and multi-layered one. It is a landmark case in the history of the American justice system, a stunning illustration of how a wrongful conviction can occur and how difficult it can be to undo. It highlights the dangers of prosecutorial misconduct, the fallibility of eyewitness testimony, and the immense power that a single, compelling, but potentially false narrative can have on a jury. The case is also a testament to the transformative power of new media. Without the serial podcast, it is almost certain that Adnan Syed would still be in prison today. The podcast democratized the investigation, bringing millions of minds to bear on a single case and creating a level of public pressure that the legal system could not ignore. It demonstrated that a well-told story, delivered in a new and accessible format, could have real-world consequences, that it could literally open prison doors. But the story does not have a happy ending. The case of who killed Hae Min Lee is now, once again, an open, unsolved murder. For Hae's family, the legal saga has been a source of unending pain and trauma. They have been forced to relive their loss again and again, first with the trial, then with the podcast, and now with the overturning of the conviction. The man they believed for 2 decades was responsible for their daughter's death is free, and they are left with no answers, no justice, and no peace. Their grief has been a public spectacle, their tragedy a piece of global entertainment. The case leaves behind a host of unsettling and ultimately unanswerable questions. If Adnan Syed did not kill Hae Min Lee, then who did? Was it Jay Wilds, the star witness, who knew details about the crime that only the killer could have known? Was it one of the 2 alternate suspects that the state's attorney's office uncovered? Or was it someone else entirely? A ghost who has never been on anyone's radar? The story of Hae Min Lee and Adnan Syed is a tragedy that has now been told from a dozen different angles. A puzzle with 1,000 pieces that still do not form a single, coherent picture. It is a story about love, jealousy, and the fragile, intense world of adolescence. It is a story about memory, about the unreliability of our own narratives and the stories we tell ourselves. And it is, ultimately, a profound and sorrowful story about the elusive nature of truth itself. A reminder that sometimes, even after all the trials, all the investigations, and all the stories, the only thing we are left with in the end is a question. The murders of the Bricca family, the Cincinnati of the 1960s, was a city of quiet, Midwestern conservatism, a place of stable, tree-lined neighborhoods and a deeply ingrained sense of family and community. In the affluent suburb of Green Hills, a planned community known for its picturesque, English-style homes and its peaceful, almost idyllic, atmosphere. The Bricca family was the very picture of that ideal. Jerry Bricca was a 26-year-old chemical engineer at Monsanto, a handsome, well-liked, and ambitious young man. His wife, 23-year-old Linda, was a former flight attendant, a beautiful and vivacious woman known for her warmth and her devotion to their young daughter. And at the center of their world was 4-year-old Debbie, a bright, happy little girl with blonde hair and a radiant smile. They lived in a small, comfortable home at 645 Bull Street, a house like any other on a street where neighbors all knew each other, where children played freely in the yards, and where the doors were often left unlocked. They were a young, promising family, living a life of apparent contentment, a life about to be extinguished in an act of violence so brutal, so personal, and so baffling that it would leave the community shattered and haunted by a mystery that endures to this day. The last time anyone saw the Bricca family alive was on the evening of Monday, September 25, 1966. Linda had spoken to her mother on the phone, a routine, pleasant conversation. Later that evening, a neighbor saw the lights on in the Bricca home and heard the faint sound of their television. It was a perfectly ordinary Monday night on a perfectly ordinary suburban street. The first sign that something was wrong came the next day, on Tuesday. A neighbor noticed that the Bricca's dogs, which were usually kept inside, were out in the yard, barking incessantly. The morning newspaper was still on the porch, uncollected. The shades in the house were all drawn, which was unusual. The neighbor, concerned but not yet alarmed, brought the dogs into her own home. The worry deepened on Wednesday. Another neighbor, a woman who often carpooled with Linda, knocked on the door. There was no answer. She peered through a window and saw a sight that sent a chill down her spine. The house was in a state of disarray. A coffee table was overturned, and there were dark, reddish-brown stains on the carpeting. It was clear that something violent had happened inside. She immediately called the police. The Green Hills Police, a small force accustomed to dealing with little more than traffic violations and petty theft, were the first to arrive. The house was unlocked. They stepped inside and were met with a scene of quiet, eerie stillness. The house was a mess, but it was not the mess of a typical robbery. It was a strange, localized chaos. The living room was in disarray, but the rest of the house was largely untouched. And the family was gone. Jerry, Linda, and little Debbie had vanished. The police immediately launched a missing persons investigation, but they were in over their heads. They called in the more experienced homicide detectives from the Hamilton County Sheriff's Office. The investigation began, and the house on Bull Street slowly began to give up its dark secrets. The bloodstains in the living room were the most obvious and terrifying clue. There was a significant amount of blood on the rug, on the sofa, and on the walls. It was clear that a violent struggle had taken place. Investigators also found what they believed to be the murder weapon, or at least one of them. A small, decorative knife from a set on the wall was missing, but the bodies were nowhere to be found. The detectives began to piece together a timeline. They believed the attack had occurred on Monday night, the last night the family was seen. They also believed that the killer or killers had not just murdered the family, but had taken their bodies with them, a detail that was both bizarre and deeply disturbing. It suggested a level of planning and audacity that was far beyond that of a simple robbery gone wrong. The search for the Bricca family became a massive, desperate effort. Police and volunteers scoured the woods, the parks, and the rivers around Cincinnati. The story became a major headline, and the community of Green Hills was plunged into a state of fear and disbelief. This was the kind of thing that happened in big cities, not in their quiet, protected enclave. As the days turned into a week, the hope of finding the family alive began to fade. The amount of blood in the house told a grim story. The police began to focus on the people in Jerry and Linda's life, searching for a motive, a secret, anything that could explain such a brutal act. They looked at Jerry's work at Monsanto. Was he involved in some kind of corporate espionage? Had he seen something he shouldn't have? They looked into Linda's past as a flight attendant. Had she crossed paths with a dangerous stranger? They interviewed friends, family, and neighbors, but they found nothing. The Briccas were, by all accounts, exactly what they appeared to be. A happy, normal, and well-liked young family with no known enemies. The breakthrough in the case came 9 days after the family had disappeared. On October 4th, 1966, the police received a call. A car, a blue Rambler station wagon belonging to the Bricca family, had been found abandoned near a bridge over the Miami Erie Canal, about 5 miles from their home. The car was unlocked, the keys still in the ignition. The police searched the area around the car, and then they searched the canal itself. But it was in the opposite direction, in a dark, overgrown field just off a quiet country road, that the final heartbreaking discovery was made. There, lying side by side in the tall grass, were the bodies of Jerry, Linda, and Debbie Bricca. They had all been stabbed to death. The violence of the attack was extreme. Linda had been stabbed multiple times in the chest and back. Jerry had also been stabbed repeatedly, and most tragically, little 4-year-old Debbie had been killed with a single precise stab wound to her back. The bodies were carefully arranged, lying next to each other, a final grotesque tableau of a family destroyed. The mystery of what had happened to the Bricca family was over, but the far more difficult and enduring mystery of who had done this to them, and why, had just begun. The police now had a triple homicide on their hands, a crime of such intimate and savage brutality that it seemed to be the work not of a stranger, but of someone who knew the family, someone who had been welcomed into their home and had then, for reasons unknown, turned on them with a terrifying, murderous rage. The quiet suburb of Green Hills had a monster in its midst, and no one had any idea who it was. The discovery of the bodies transformed the case from a disturbing missing persons mystery into a full-blown murder investigation that horrified the entire Cincinnati area. The autopsies confirmed the brutal nature of the crime. All 3 family members had been killed by multiple stab wounds, inflicted with a thin, sharp blade consistent with the missing decorative knife from their home. The violence was personal and extreme. Linda Bricca had been gagged with her own underwear and bound with rope. The bindings were tied with a series of complex, distinctive knots. Most chillingly, the medical examiner determined that Jerry and Debbie had likely been killed first, and that Linda had been kept alive for a time, subjected to a period of terror and assault before she was finally murdered. The crime scene, both at the house and where the bodies were found, offered a series of perplexing and contradictory clues. The house had been left in a state of disarray, but it was not a convincing robbery. Valuables were left untouched. The act of removing the bodies from the house and transporting them 5 miles away suggested a killer who was both daring and methodical, someone who was not acting in a blind panic. Yet, leaving the family car near the canal with the keys still in it seemed like a careless, amateurish mistake. The detectives of the Hamilton County Sheriff's Office were faced with a puzzle that seemed to have no logical solution. The crime had the savage, personal intensity of a crime of passion, but there was no obvious suspect who harbored such rage against the family. It also had elements of a planned, calculated act, but the motive for such a crime was completely absent. The investigation began to focus intently on the Bricka's inner circle, operating on the strong probability that the killer was someone they knew, someone they had willingly let into their home on that final Monday night. The detectives began the painstaking process of interviewing every friend, neighbor, colleague, and family member, building a picture of the Bricka's life and searching for any hidden conflict, any secret that could have led to such a brutal end. One of the first and most enduring areas of suspicion centered on Jerry Bricka's workplace, the Monsanto Chemical Company. Jerry was a rising star at the company, a talented engineer working in a competitive and high-stakes environment. The police explored the possibility that he had been involved in some form of corporate espionage, or that he had discovered a secret at the company that had made him a target. They questioned his colleagues extensively, but this line of inquiry, while tantalizing, never yielded any concrete evidence. The investigation then turned to the family's social life. The Brickas were a popular and outgoing couple who had a wide circle of friends. The police began to look for any signs of jealousy, of romantic entanglements, of any hidden resentments that might have been simmering beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect lives. They learned that Linda Bricka, in particular, was known for her vivacious and sometimes flirtatious personality, a fact that led them to explore the possibility of a spurned admirer or a jealous lover. This line of inquiry led them to one of the most prominent and most mysterious figures in the entire case, a local veterinarian named Dr. Fred Leininger. Dr. Leininger was a friend of the Bricka family. He was also a man with a reputation. He was known to be a charismatic but volatile figure, a man with a passion for archery and a known history of extramarital affairs. Investigators learned that Leininger had a close, and some said, inappropriately close, relationship with Linda Bricka. The suspicions surrounding Dr. Leininger intensified when detectives discovered several key facts. He had no alibi for the night of the murders. He had a history of making unwanted advances toward women, and most compellingly, as an avid outdoorsman and sailor, he was an expert at tying complex knots, the same kind of distinctive knots that had been used to bind Linda Bricka. The police brought Dr. Leininger in for questioning. He was subjected to a lie detector test, which he reportedly failed. His behavior was erratic and suspicious. He seemed to be the most promising suspect the police had, but there was a problem. There was no direct, physical evidence to tie him to the crime scene. His fingerprints were not found in the house. There was no blood on his clothing. And despite their intense suspicions, the police could never find enough evidence to charge him. Dr. Fred Leininger would remain the primary, but unindicted suspect for decades, a shadow hanging over the case. His name forever linked to the Bricka murders in the court of public opinion, if not in a court of law. With the Leininger lead stalled, the investigation began to lose momentum. The case was a frustrating collection of dead ends. The police had a host of theories, but no hard evidence to support any of them. The mystery of the Bricka family murders became one of Cincinnati's most enduring and haunting cold cases. The house on Bull Street was sold, and new families moved in. But the memory of the crime lingered, a ghost in the quiet, suburban neighborhood. For years, the case lay, dormant, the file gathering dust in the cold case archives. But the story never completely went away. It was kept alive by local journalists, by true crime enthusiasts, and by a new generation of investigators who were unwilling to let the family's brutal murder become a forgotten piece of history. Then, decades after the crime, a new and astonishing piece of information emerged, a piece that would throw the entire case into a new light and point the investigation in a completely unexpected direction. A woman came forward with a story. She claimed that she had been a neighbor of the Brickas back in 1966, and she claimed that she had seen something on the night of the murders, something she had been too afraid to report at the time. She said that on that Monday night, she had seen a man in the Brickas driveway, but it was not a stranger, and it was not Dr. Leininger. It was a man that she and everyone else in the neighborhood knew. He was a prominent local figure, a man who was, at the time, considered to be completely above suspicion. His name was Richard Dick Cull, and he was the Brickas' former minister. This new revelation, coming decades after the fact, would send a shockwave through the long-dormant investigation, forcing everyone to re-examine the case and to consider a possibility that was, in its own way, as terrifying as any other. That the monster who had destroyed the Bricka family was not a jealous lover or a corporate spy, but a man of God. The emergence of Richard Cull as a potential suspect, decades after the fact, was a stunning development that forced a complete reevaluation of the Bricka case. Cull, who had passed away in the intervening years, was not a figure who had been on anyone's radar during the original investigation. He was the pastor of the local Presbyterian church that the Bricka family had attended. He was a respected, well-liked community leader, a man who had offered comfort and spiritual guidance to his congregation in the aftermath of the shocking murders. The idea that he could have been involved was almost unthinkable. But the new witness, a woman named Joan Young, was credible. Her story, which she had kept secret for over 40 years out of fear and uncertainty, was detailed and specific. She claimed that on the night of the murders, she had been walking her dog past the Bricka house and had seen a man she clearly recognized as Reverend Cull standing in the driveway, next to a car that matched the description of the Brickas Rambler. She said he appeared agitated. At the time, she thought little of it. But in the days that followed, as the news of the family's disappearance and murder broke, she became terrified. She was a young woman at the time and was afraid to come forward with information that implicated such a powerful and respected figure. Her testimony, when it was finally made public through the work of investigative journalists and authors who were re-examining the case, opened up a whole new line of inquiry. Investigators, both amateur and official, began to dig into the life of Richard Cull, and what they found was a portrait of a man who was far more complex and troubled than his public persona suggested. They discovered that Cull had a close, and perhaps unusually intense, relationship with Linda Bricka. He had been providing her with marriage counseling in the months leading up to the murders. Linda had reportedly confided in him about her marital problems and her unhappiness. This suggested a level of intimacy and a potential emotional entanglement that went far beyond that of a typical pastor-parishioner relationship. Could this relationship have been the motive? Had Cull developed an obsession with Linda? Had she rejected him, leading to a fit of murderous, righteous rage? This theory gained more traction as investigators uncovered more about Cull's personality. Behind the veneer of the respectable minister was a man with a documented history of a volatile temper and a deep-seated, almost obsessive, interest in the dark side of human nature. He was known to be fascinated with true crime stories and had a particular interest in the psychology of murder. Most disturbingly, several people came forward to report strange and unsettling encounters they had had with Cull in the aftermath of the Bricka murders. One story in particular stood out. A woman who had been a member of his congregation recalled a conversation she had with Cull a few weeks after the bodies were found. She had been expressing her fear and her horror at the crime, and Cull, in a strange attempt to reassure her, had said something that, in retrospect, was deeply chilling. He told her not to worry, that the killer was not a maniac, but was likely someone who loved the Brickas and had killed them to put them out of their misery. It was a bizarre, almost confessional statement, a strange echo of the kind of twisted, righteous logic that a killer might use to justify such a horrific act. With this new focus on Cull, investigators began to re-examine the physical evidence from the crime scene. The distinctive, complex knots used to bind Linda Bricca had always been a key clue. The original investigation had focused on Dr. Fred Leininger because of his expertise with sailing knots. But now a new possibility emerged. Richard Cull had served in the military as a paratrooper. He would have been an expert in tying the specific complex knots used in rigging parachutes, knots that were remarkably similar to the ones found on Linda's body. The case against Cull was circumstantial, but it was compelling. It provided a suspect who had a close personal connection to the family, a potential motive rooted in a complex emotional entanglement, a personality that harbored a dark, hidden side, and a specific skill set that matched a key piece of evidence from the crime scene. The theory was that Cull had gone to the house that night, perhaps to continue a counseling session with Linda, or to profess his feelings for her. An argument had ensued, things had escalated, and in a fit of rage, he had murdered the entire family. He had then, in a calculated move to cover his tracks, transported the bodies to a remote location, hoping they would never be found. But there was another, equally compelling, theory that also gained traction in the renewed investigation, a theory that brought the focus back to the original prime suspect, Dr. Fred Leininger. Even as the case against Cull was being built, other investigators continued to believe that Leininger was the real killer. They pointed to his failed lie detector test, his lack of a solid alibi, and his known obsession with Linda Bricca. The case against Leininger was bolstered by new witness testimony as well. A woman who had been a former lover of Leininger's came forward with a story. She claimed that Leininger was a man capable of extreme jealousy and violence. She also recounted a chilling detail. She said that Leininger had a habit of carrying a small, sharp knife with him, a knife that was consistent with the type of weapon used in the murders. The two competing theories, the minister theory and the veterinarian theory, now became the central focus of the debate surrounding the Bricca case. Both Cull and Leininger were plausible suspects. Both had the means, the motive, and the opportunity. Both were men with a dark, hidden side that contradicted their public personas. The case had not one, but two, compelling monsters at its heart. This left investigators and the public with a frustrating and deeply unsettling problem. The two strongest suspects were now both dead. Richard Cull had died in the 1990s. Fred Leininger had died in 2004. With their deaths, the chance of a confession, the one thing that could have brought a definitive resolution to the case, was gone forever. The Bricca family murders had become a historical whodunit, a cold case with two ghosts as its prime suspects. The investigation was now a battle of competing narratives, a process of sifting through old files, of re-interviewing aging witnesses, of trying to find a single, definitive piece of evidence in a case that was now more than half a century old. The hope of ever truly solving the mystery, of ever knowing for certain who had walked into that quiet house on Bull Street and destroyed a family, was beginning to fade. The case seemed destined to remain a permanent, haunting question mark in the history of American crime. The renewed interest in the Bricca family murders in the 21st century, fueled by the compelling new theories surrounding Richard Cull and the persistent suspicion of Fred Leininger, led to one final, desperate attempt to find a scientific answer in a case that was drowning in speculation. The hope, as with so many cold cases, lay in the power of modern forensic science. The key was DNA. In the years following the emergence of the new witness testimony, investigators and true crime authors worked to get the original physical evidence from the 1966 crime scene re-examined. This evidence, which had been stored away for decades, included the blood-soaked carpeting from the Bricca home, the ropes used to bind Linda, and other items that might hold a microscopic trace of the killer. The goal was to develop a DNA profile of the perpetrator, which could then be compared against DNA from the two primary suspects. Securing DNA from the deceased suspects was a complex but not impossible task. Investigators were able to obtain DNA samples from living relatives of both Richard Cull and Fred Leininger, allowing them to build a familial DNA profile for each man. The stage was now set for a final scientific showdown, a test that could potentially, after more than 50 years of silence, finally point the finger of guilt and solve the mystery once and for all. The forensic testing was conducted, and the results were eagerly awaited by everyone who had become obsessed with the case. But when the results came back, They were a familiar echo of the frustration that has defined this case from the very beginning. They were inconclusive. The lab was able to develop a partial DNA profile from the evidence, but it was too degraded, too compromised by the passage of time and the primitive evidence collection techniques of the 1960s, to provide a definitive match. The results could not conclusively link either Richard Cull or Fred Leininger to the crime scene, but neither could they definitively exclude them. The scientific Hail Mary, the last great hope for a certain answer, had failed. The case had once again slipped back into the murky, unsatisfying realm of circumstantial evidence and competing theories. The legacy of the Bricca family murders is a profound and sorrowful one. It is a story that stands as a haunting testament to the enduring pain of an unsolved crime. For the community of Green Hills, the murders were a deep and permanent wound, a violent intrusion that shattered the town's innocent, post-war sense of itself. The case became a local legend, a ghost story that was passed down through generations, a cautionary tale about the dark secrets that can lie hidden behind the closed doors of even the most perfect-looking suburban homes. For law enforcement, the Bricca case is a study in the frustrations of a pre-modern investigation. The initial catastrophic contamination of the crime scene and the failure to collect and preserve evidence in a way that would stand up to modern scientific scrutiny meant that the case was likely unsolvable from the very first day. It is a powerful reminder of how far forensic science has come, and of how many older, cold cases are likely to remain that way forever, their secrets lost to the limitations of a bygone era. But the most powerful legacy of the Bricca case is its deeply human one. It is the story of a young, happy family, full of promise, who were erased from the world in a single, brutal act of violence. It is the story of Jerry, the brilliant young engineer, of Linda, the vibrant and loving mother, and of little Debbie, the 4-year-old girl whose life was extinguished before it had even truly begun. Their story is a reminder that behind every great unsolved mystery, behind every compelling theory and every shadowy suspect, there are real human beings, real lives that were lived, and real love that was lost. The enduring fascination with the case is a testament to our collective need for narrative closure, for a story that has a clear beginning, middle, and end. The Bricca case denies us this. It leaves us with a permanent, unsettling ambiguity. We have 2 plausible villains, 2 compelling narratives, but no final chapter. The mystery is not who did it, but which one did it? Was it the veterinarian, his hands skilled at both healing and, perhaps, at tying the knots that bind? Or was it the minister, a man of God whose quiet public faith may have concealed a private, violent torment? Both possibilities are equally terrifying. They both speak to the same dark truth, that the monsters we fear are not always the shadowy strangers, but are often the people we know, the people we trust, the people who are a part of the fabric of our own community. Today, the house at 645 Bull Street still stands, a quiet, unassuming home on a quiet suburban street. But it will forever be the Bricca house. It is a silent monument to a family, and to a mystery that has become a permanent part of the dark folklore of the American Midwest. The case of the Bricca family murders will likely never be officially solved. The truth is buried with the victims and with the 2 men who remain the primary, ghostly suspects. The file may be cold, but the story remains, a haunting, unanswered question. A quiet, sorrowful echo that can still be heard in the stillness of a suburban night.